There is a genetic signature that does not belong to most of Europe. It is ancient, rare, outside of two very specific populations on opposite ends of the continent, and it has been sitting quietly in human DNA for so long that the people who carry it have largely forgotten it is there. One population lives in a cluster of green hills between France and Spain, in a region the Romans never fully conquered, and that no empire in recorded history ever managed to absorb. The other lives on the northern and western fringes of Scotland, on islands and peninsulas where the Atlantic comes in hard and cold and the light in summer stays pale until midnight. They call themselves different things. They speak entirely different languages. Their recorded histories have almost nothing to do with each other, and yet inside their cells, in the particular arrangement of a genetic marker carried on the male chromosome, they share something that the populations between them do not. Something that predates every name we have given to every nation in between. Something so old that when geneticists first identified it, the implications were difficult to absorb. The question of why two populations separated by an entire continent share a bloodline that no one else has is a question that reaches much further back than the Middle Ages or the Roman period or even the Bronze Age migrations that reshaped the genetic landscape of Europe. It reaches back to the end of the last ice age, to a world of glaciers and tundra and small scattered groups of human beings clinging to the habitable margins of a continent that was mostly covered in ice, to a period of human history so remote that even archaeology struggles to find its traces and even genetics can only read its shadows, and to the possibility that the people who survived that world, who made it through the worst cold the planet has seen in the entire span of human civilization, were the ancestors of a lineage that has never fully disappeared. That has persisted, in the bodies of the Basques and the Scots, all the way to now. If you are winding down right now, if the day is behind you and the quiet is starting to settle, then this is the right kind of story for where you are. It moves slowly, because the time it covers is enormous. It does not rush toward a conclusion because the conclusion is still being assembled, piece by piece, in laboratories and in ancient graves, and in the oral traditions of people who have known something for a very long time that the academic world is only now beginning to catch up to. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The Basques have always known they were different. Not in the way that every culture considers itself distinct and special, though they certainly have that quality too. Different in a more fundamental sense. Different in the way that the Basque language, Euskara, is different from every other language in Europe. It has no cousins, no linguistic relatives that anyone has ever convincingly identified. It stands alone in the European language family, in a way that suggests its speakers were in their current location before the Indo-European languages arrived and swept across the continent, and that they were, in some sense, isolated from that sweep in ways that allowed their original language to persist. The Basques call their homeland Euskal Herria, the land of the Basque speakers, and it spans parts of what are now northern Spain and southwestern France, in a compact territory nestled between the Pyrenees and the Atlantic coast. The landscape is steep and green and heavily forested, cut by rivers running down from the mountains, with a coastline that faces west into the Bay of Biscay. The Basques are famously, sometimes aggressively, aware of their uniqueness. Their culture is strong, their sense of identity is fierce, and their relationship with the concept of outside authority has never been comfortable. In terms of genetic markers, the scientific evidence supports what the Basques have always claimed culturally. They are different. When researchers began doing systematic genetic surveys of European populations in the 1990s and early 2000s, the Basques consistently showed up as an outlier. Their frequency of certain Y chromosome haplogroups, the genetic lineages carried in the male line from father to son, was unlike anything else in the surrounding populations. And when the researchers looked at which haplogroup was most distinctively elevated in the Basque population, they found something that connected the Basques to a place that seems at first hearing entirely improbable. Scotland. Specifically, the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland, the most Atlantic-facing parts of the country, the areas that had the longest history of Gaelic culture and the deepest roots in the pre-Norse, pre-Anglo-Saxon, pre-Roman layers of Scottish identity. The genetic signal that made the Basques distinctive was present in those Scottish populations at frequencies that dwarfed any other European population between the two, not uniformly across Scotland. Not in the lowlands, which had been much more heavily influenced by the various waves of continental migration that had been moving through Britain over the millennia, but in the western periphery, in the Hebrides, and the Atlantic-facing mainland and the peninsulas that reach out toward Ireland, the ancient Iberian signal was strong. The marker in question is a specific Y chromosome haplogroup, the genetic lineage designated as R1b, M269, in its most common European form, but with particular attention to an older, deeper branch of that lineage that predates the widespread distribution of R1b across Europe, and that is found at unusually high frequency, specifically in the Basque Country and the western Scottish Highlands. The specific genetics are complex, and the field has been in motion, with new data and new analyses revising earlier interpretations, but the core observation has remained consistent through all the revisions. There is a genetic relationship between these two populations, at a time depth that precedes any historically documented contact between them, that requires an explanation older than anything written down. The explanation that the genetic data has increasingly pointed toward is one that requires a journey back to approximately 12,000 years ago, to the period when the last ice age was drawing to a close, and the ice that had covered most of northern Europe was beginning its slow retreat northward. The continent that was being uncovered as the glaciers retreated was not the green and forested Europe we know today. It was a landscape of tundra and permafrost, and slowly colonizing vegetation, gradually being reoccupied by plants and animals, and eventually by people moving in from the refugia where they had sheltered during the worst of the cold. The refugia are the key to everything. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 25,000 to 15,000 years ago, the ice sheets covered Scandinavia, the British Isles north of the Thames, much of Central Europe, and the alpine regions of the continent. The populations of Homo sapiens that had been living in Europe before the ice advanced were not destroyed. They pulled back to areas that remained habitable, the relatively warmer, ice-free zones along the southern margins of the continent. The Iberian Peninsula was one of the most important of these refugia. The southwestern corner of Europe, sheltered by the Pyrenees from the worst of the continental cold and moderated by the Atlantic maritime climate, remained habitable throughout the glacial maximum. And the coastal zone of what is now northern Spain and southwestern France, the zone that would later become the Basque homeland, was among the most hospitable parts of that already hospitable refugium. People lived there during the Ice Age. Not modern Basques, not any people with a name we would recognize, but people who were anatomically and cognitively modern in every sense, who made art on cave walls with a sophistication and expressiveness that has never been fully explained by any simple theory of early human capability. The painted caves of the Cantabrian coast, which runs along northern Spain in the general zone of the Basque Country, include some of the oldest and most remarkable examples of Paleolithic art in the world. Altamira, with its great ceiling of painted bison, has been dated to paintings made between 17,000 and 22,000 years ago. El Castillo, nearby, has red disc paintings that push back even further, potentially to 34,000 years ago. The people who made these images were living in the Ice Age refugium of southwestern Europe. They were the ancestors of the people who would eventually, as the ice retreated, move northward and repopulate the continent. The expansion from the Iberian refugium as the ice retreated is one of the most important demographic events in European prehistory. Genetic evidence shows that a large proportion of the ancestry of modern Western Europeans traces back to this expansion. The people of the refugium moved northward along the Atlantic coast as the ice retreated, following the coast of what is now France, and eventually crossing to the British Isles as sea levels were still low enough to make Britain accessible over land, or nearly so. They brought with them the genetic lineages that had been preserved and refined through tens of thousands of years of refugium survival, including, specifically, the Y chromosome lineages that would later show up as the distinctive genetic signal of the Basques and the Western Scots. The connection between the two populations, then, is not a mystery of contact between distant peoples in historical times. It is a shared inheritance from a common ancestral population that lived in the Ice Age refugium of southwestern Europe and whose descendants spread northward as the world warmed. The Basques are the most direct descendants of that refugium population because they stayed, because the Basque Country was part of the refugium itself, and the people there have been there, in some form of continuity, since the Ice Age. The Western Scots carry the signal because their ancestors were among the post-glacial migrants who moved northward along the Atlantic coast from the refugium and colonized the British Isles as the ice retreated. The populations between them, the French, the English, the Germans, the people of Central Europe, carry far less of this ancient signal because their territories were later overrun by the great waves of migration that reshaped European genetics in the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age. The farmers who arrived from Anatolia around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, the steppe pastoralists who arrived from the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 5,000 years ago, bringing the Indo-European languages and a fundamentally new genetic profile. These migrations swept through the populations of continental Europe and diluted the ancient refugium signal that had been there. But in the geographic periphery, in the corners that the migrations reached last, or with the least force, the old signal persisted. The Basques, in their mountain redoubt between Spain and France. The Western Scots, on their Atlantic-facing islands and peninsulas, both of them carrying, in their Y chromosomes, the memory of the Ice Age refugium. This is not a small story. This is one of the oldest stories in Europe, encoded in the most durable archive available to us, the human genome. It is the story of survival, of people who held on through the worst climate the planet has seen in the entirety of human civilization, in a small zone of habitable land at the southwestern edge of the continent, and who emerged from that survival with a population and a genetic heritage that then spread to fill a continent, and whose most concentrated and clearest expression, thousands of years later, is still visible in two populations that have retained more of that ancient inheritance than anyone between them. The story does not end with the genetics. It never does with the human past. The genetics tell you who was related to whom and in what rough sequence. They do not tell you what those people believed, what they built, what they knew, what they lost, what they passed on in forms that no DNA test can recover. For those questions, you need other kinds of evidence: the archaeology, the language, the oral tradition, the landscape itself, where the marks of ancient human presence are sometimes so subtle that only a trained eye can see them, and sometimes so dramatic that it is astonishing they have been ignored as long as they have. The Basque language is one of the most discussed pieces of this puzzle. Euskara, as it is known to its speakers, is a language isolate. It has no demonstrable relationship to any other language in the world. The Indo-European languages of Europe, English, French, Spanish, German, Russian, Irish, and all the others, form a great family of related tongues that share a common ancestry traceable back to a proto-language spoken on the Pontic steppe thousands of years ago. The Semitic languages of the Middle East form another family. The Sino-Tibetan languages of East Asia form another. Virtually every language spoken anywhere in the world can be placed in a family with relatives, near and distant. But Euskara stands alone. Its grammar, its vocabulary, its phonology, its entire structure is unlike anything else. The most compelling explanation for this isolation is that Euskara is what remains of the languages spoken in the pre-Indo-European Europe of the Mesolithic and early Neolithic periods. The languages that were spoken by the descendants of the Ice Age refugium populations before the steppe migrants arrived with their Proto-Indo-European tongue and gradually replaced the existing languages across most of the system. Continent. The Basques, protected by their mountains and their tenacity and their geographic remove from the main corridors of migration, kept their language when everyone else around them eventually lost theirs. Euskara is, in this interpretation, a fossil. Not a dead fossil, because it is very much alive and spoken by hundreds of thousands of people today, but a living fossil, in the sense that it represents a form of linguistic life that was once widespread across Europe and that survives only here, in this one corner, because the people who speak it never stopped speaking it. This has direct relevance to the Scots connection. Because if the Western Scots carry genetic inheritance from the same refugium population as the Basques, then the languages of the pre-Indo-European British Isles may also have been related, however distantly, to the ancestor of Euskara, the languages spoken in Scotland and Ireland before the Celtic languages arrived, the languages of the people who built the great megalithic monuments of the Atlantic facade, are entirely lost. We have no written record of them, no vocabulary, no grammar. We know they existed because the megaliths exist, and because the people who built them must have had languages, but we have no direct access to what those languages were. Some researchers have proposed that the pre-Celtic languages of the British Isles and the pre-Indo-European languages of the continent, including the ancestor of Euskara, may have formed a loose family of related tongues, spoken by the Atlantic coastal populations who descended from the Ice Age refugium. This hypothesis, sometimes called the Vasconic hypothesis after the Latin name for the Basque Country, is contested. It remains at the edge of mainstream academic linguistics. But the genetic evidence, which shows a genuine shared ancestry between the Basques and the Atlantic coastal populations of Britain, gives it at least a plausible demographic foundation. If the same people spoke related languages, it would not be surprising to find that the surviving language of one branch of that population retained structural features related to what was once spoken by the other. The megalithic monuments are where the story becomes most visible in the landscape. The great stone structures of the Atlantic coast, from the passage tombs of Ireland and Scotland through the standing stone circles of Brittany to the dolmens and alignments of the Iberian Peninsula, were built by a people who shared genetic ancestry, who were connected by the Atlantic sea routes that were their highways, and who expressed their relationship to the dead and the sky and the cycles of the year in a material culture that was recognizably coherent across an enormous geographic range. Newgrange in Ireland, Maeshowe in Orkney, the alignments at Carnac in Brittany, the megalithic tombs of the Basque Country itself, all of these structures share features, orientations, construction techniques, and symbolic vocabularies that speak to a shared cultural tradition. That shared tradition was the product of the Atlantic coastal network, the network of people who had descended from the Ice Age refugium populations, who had spread northward along the Atlantic facade as the ice retreated, who maintained contact and exchange across the sea routes of the Atlantic, and who built their most enduring monuments in the places where that maritime tradition was strongest. The Basques and the Western Scots are the modern inheritors of that tradition at its two most geographically extreme points. The genetic signal that connects them is the biological record of the people who built those monuments, who sailed between those coasts, who shared, over many generations, and in ways we cannot now fully reconstruct, a heritage that the steppe migrants and their Indo-European languages and their new genetic profiles eventually overlaid but never fully replaced. There is something remarkable about the persistence of this ancient signal. Europe has been through enormous demographic upheaval in the past 10,000 years. The arrival of farming from Anatolia, the spread of steppe ancestry that brought the Indo-European languages, the historical movements of peoples in the Roman period, the migration period, the medieval expansions. Each of these events shifted the genetic composition of European populations in ways that are now clearly legible in the ancient DNA record. And yet, in the Basque Country and the Western Scottish Highlands, something from before all of that persists, something that was already in place before farming arrived in Europe, something that represents the biological continuity of the people who survived the ice. The persistence is not accidental. Geography helps. The Basques have always been sheltered by their mountains. The Western Scots have always been sheltered by their remoteness, their islands, their Atlantic position that made them peripheral to the main currents of continental migration. But geography is not the whole explanation. There is also something about the cultural tenacity of these populations, the fierceness with which they have maintained their identities, that has contributed to the preservation of their genetic heritage. The Basques did not assimilate into the surrounding Spanish and French populations. The Gaelic peoples of the Western Scottish Highlands did not assimilate into the lowland Scottish culture that was much more heavily influenced by successive waves of external influence. They held on. They stayed who they were. And in staying who they were, they preserved, perhaps without fully understanding its significance, a biological thread running all the way back to the ice. The thread is not invisible. It has been visible to the geneticists who have been studying European population history for the past 3 decades. What has been missing is the full reckoning with what it means. The academic discourse around European genetic history has tended to focus on the big demographic events, the farming transition, the steppe migration, the Bronze Age reshaping of European populations, the ancient refugium signal, the pre-Neolithic ancestry that shows up most clearly in the Basques and the Western Atlantic populations, has been acknowledged but not always given the attention it deserves as a story in its own right. It is a story in its own right. It is the story of the original Europeans, or at least of the first modern humans to establish a lasting presence in Europe, surviving the worst climate catastrophe the continent has experienced in human history, and then spreading their descendants and their lineages across the Atlantic facade as conditions improved. It is the story of a resilience so deep that it is still visible in living people today. And it is the story of a connection between two populations that stands as a rebuke to the assumption that isolated peoples, separated by geography and time, must be genetically unrelated. The Basques and the Western Scots are not separated by the European continent. They are connected by something older than the continent's current configuration. They are connected by the ice. There is a valley in the Basque Country, inland from the coast, where the hillsides are covered in oak forest and the river runs clear over limestone. It is the kind of place that has been inhabited for a very long time because it offers everything that a human settlement needs: water, shelter from the worst weather, game in the forest, the possibility of small-scale cultivation on the valley floor, and the particular quality of light that comes into steep valleys in the late afternoon, golden and slow, that makes the world feel habitable in a way that open landscapes sometimes do not. In that valley there are traces of habitation going back thousands of years. The most recent layer, the current villages with their stone houses and their ancient communal institutions and their festivals in the old language, sits above layers of occupation that the archaeology is only beginning to fully reveal. Below the medieval layers there are Roman-era traces. Below those, the Iron Age. Below the Iron Age, the Bronze Age. And below the Bronze Age, in the earliest levels that the archaeologists have reached, there are the remains of a way of life that was already old when farming arrived from the east. The people who left those earliest traces in the Basque Valley were not farmers. They were the descendants of the Ice Age refugium population who had been in this region for tens of thousands of years. They hunted the deer in the oak forest and fished the limestone river and gathered the plants of the valley margins and lived in the particular intimate relationship with their specific landscape that comes from being in one place for a very long time. They knew this valley. They knew its rhythms and its resources and its dangers. They knew where the deer would be in summer and where they would shelter in winter. They knew which plants were good to eat and which would make you sick. They knew the paths through the mountains and the places where passage became difficult and the seasons when the passes opened and closed. That knowledge, accumulated over generations beyond counting, is what they passed on. Not in writing, because writing had not been invented. Not even in the kind of formal instruction that we associate with organized education, but in the practical transmission of skill and knowledge from parent to child and from elder to young person. That is how most human knowledge has always moved through time. And embedded in that transmission, in the stories told around fires in the long winter evenings, in the names given to the places in the valley, in the ceremonial practices associated with the significant moments of the year, was the cultural inheritance of a people who had been in this landscape since before anyone alive could remember. The Basque language is the most durable remnant of that inheritance. Every other language of pre-Indo-European Europe has been lost, replaced by the languages brought by the farmers and then by the steppe migrants. But Euskara survived. And in surviving, it carried with it the words and the grammar and the structure of thought of the people who had been in southwestern Europe since the Ice Age. Those words are not just sounds. They encode ways of organizing experience, of naming the world, of relating to the landscape and to each other, that are the product of a very specific and very long history in a very specific place. When linguists study Euskara, one of the things they note is its relationship to the landscape of the Basque Country. Many of the basic vocabulary items in Euskara have transparent connections to the physical features of the local environment, connections that suggest the language developed in intimate relationship with that specific landscape over a very long time. The word for sky, for instance, has the same root as the word for the place above, not in an abstract metaphorical sense, but in a very concrete, directional sense, as though the sky was originally named by people who spent a lot of time looking up at the particular sky of the Pyrenean foothills. These are the kinds of subtle linguistic traces that suggest a language grew up in a specific place and has been spoken there for a very long time, long enough for the landscape to leave its marks on the vocabulary. The parallel in the Scottish Gaelic tradition is the relationship between the language and the seascape of the Western Islands and coastline. Scottish Gaelic has an enormous and specific vocabulary for the sea, for the various conditions of water and wind and tide and current that are the daily experience of people whose lives are organized around the Atlantic coast. This vocabulary is more than just practical. It encodes a relationship with the sea that runs deep enough to have shaped the way the world is categorized and named in the language. The Gaelic speakers of the Western Islands did not simply live near the sea. The sea was the organizing principle of their existence, and their language reflects that. But the deepest language of the Western Scottish Islands is not Gaelic. Gaelic arrived in Scotland from Ireland in the early centuries of the Common Era, brought by the people who built the kingdom of Dalriata across the narrow waters of the North Channel. Before Gaelic, there was something else, the language of the Picts, the language of whatever peoples inhabited the Western Islands before the Gaelic expansion reached them. Those languages are gone. We have, for the most part, only a handful of place names and personal names, and from those fragments very little can be confidently reconstructed. But the place names are interesting. Some of the place names in the Western Scottish Islands and in the most ancient layers of Highland Scottish toponymy have features that linguists have found difficult to explain within any Indo-European framework. They have sounds and structures that do not fit the patterns of Gaelic or Brittonic or Norse, the three Indo-European languages that have left the most prominent marks on Scottish place names, and some of them have been tentatively compared, with much uncertainty and appropriate hedging, to structural features found in Euskara. The comparison is not settled. It is one of those suggestions that serious linguists make cautiously, with a full awareness of the difficulty of reconstructing lost languages from fragmentary evidence and of the danger of finding similarities that are coincidental rather than genealogical. But the suggestion has been made by researchers who are not cranks and who have the methodological training to understand what they are and are not claiming. And it sits within the broader context of the genetic evidence, which clearly shows a connection between the ancestral populations of the Western Scottish Highlands and the Basque Country, a connection that reaches back to the Ice Age refugium. If those populations were genetically related, if they shared a common ancestry in the post-glacial expansion along the Atlantic facade, then the possibility that their languages were also related, that the pre-Gaelic languages of the Western Scottish Islands belong to the same broad family as the ancestor of Euskara, is not inherently implausible. It is a hypothesis. It needs more evidence, more research, more careful application of the methods of historical linguistics to what can be reconstructed of the pre-Indo-European languages of the British Isles. But it is a hypothesis that the genetic evidence gives a demographic foundation for. The people who would have spoken those languages, the pre-Gaelic inhabitants of the Western Scottish Islands, were genetically related to the people who speak Euskara. The possibility that their languages reflected that relationship is not nothing. The archaeology of the Atlantic facade is where the most tangible traces of the shared heritage show up. The megalithic tradition, which produced the great stone monuments that dot the western coastlines of Europe from Portugal to Orkney, was the cultural expression of the Atlantic coastal network that connected the descendants of the Ice Age refugium populations. These were not isolated local developments. They were part of a coherent tradition of monument building that extended across an enormous geographic range, built by people who were in contact with each other, who shared ideas and techniques, and perhaps beliefs and ritual practices across the sea routes of the Atlantic. The passage tombs are the most architecturally sophisticated expression of this tradition. These are structures in which a long stone-lined passage leads to a burial chamber, usually circular or cruciform in plan, covered by a massive mound of earth or stone. They are found in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, in Brittany, and in scattered examples along the Iberian coast. They share not just a general architectural concept, but specific construction details. The way the roof stones are corbelled to create a stable chamber, the use of decorated curbstones around the base of the mound, the orientation of the passage to allow the light of the rising or setting sun at a specific astronomical moment to penetrate to the back of the chamber. The astronomical orientations are among the most striking features of the megalithic tradition. Newgrange in Ireland, the most famous example, is oriented so that the rising sun at the winter solstice shines directly along the passage and illuminates the chamber floor. The alignment is precise to within a few degrees, which means whoever designed it had a careful understanding of the solar cycle and had observed the winter solstice sunrise carefully enough to know exactly where the sun would appear on the horizon at that moment. This is not coincidental. This is the product of sustained astronomical observation, transmitted through a tradition sophisticated enough to put that observation into permanent form in stone. The same tradition of astronomical orientation appears at megalithic sites throughout the Atlantic zone. Maeshowe in Orkney is oriented to the winter solstice sunset. The great megalithic tomb at Bryn Celyn Didw in Wales has a solar alignment at the summer solstice. Various Breton megalithic structures show orientations to astronomical events that the builders clearly understood and deliberately encoded. And in the Basque Country and the broader northern Iberian zone, the dolmens and passage tombs that represent the local expression of the megalithic tradition also show evidence of astronomical awareness, of a concern with the relationship between the burial of the dead and the movements of the sun that seems to reflect a shared cosmological tradition. What that cosmological tradition actually said, what it meant to the people who built these monuments, what beliefs about death and the afterlife and the relationship between the living and the dead were encoded in the astronomical alignments and the chamber orientations, we do not know. We cannot know, because those beliefs were never written down and were not transmitted into any surviving cultural tradition in a form that allows us to read them directly. What we have is the architecture, the precision, the scale, the sheer investment of human effort, of organized labor, of sustained cultural commitment that these monuments represent. The investment is extraordinary. Moving the stones for a major megalithic monument required the coordination of hundreds or thousands of people over periods of years or decades in a social context that could sustain that level of organized effort. The people of the Atlantic megalithic tradition were not, as earlier generations of archaeologists sometimes imagined, simple hunter-gatherers or primitive farmers barely beyond subsistence. They were people with complex social organization, sufficient surplus to support non-food-producing activities on a large scale, and a cultural tradition that prioritized the construction of permanent monuments sufficiently to dedicate enormous resources to them. That level of complexity leaves traces in the genetics as well as in the archaeology. Population size is correlated with the development of complex social organization. The relatively high frequency of the ancient refugium lineages in the Basque and Western Scottish populations, even after thousands of years of demographic change, suggests that these were not tiny, isolated groups that barely maintained viability. They were populations of sufficient size and internal diversity to sustain the social complexity that the megalithic monuments represent. They were not a remnant, they were a presence. A genuine and sustained human presence on the Atlantic coast, from the end of the Ice Age through the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age, that built the most impressive landscape monuments in pre-industrial European history. The Bronze Age is when the story becomes most complicated. The arrival of the steppe ancestry that is associated with the spread of Indo-European languages had profound effects on the genetic composition of the British Isles. Ancient DNA from Bronze Age British sites shows that the transition was dramatic. In the period between about 4,500 and 3,500 years ago, the genetic composition of Britain shifted enormously. The ancestry associated with the Neolithic farmers, and through them with the Atlantic coastal populations of refugium ancestry, was largely replaced by steppe-derived ancestry. The replacement was not total, but it was substantial. In most parts of Britain, the pre-Bronze Age ancestry was reduced to a minority contribution. The Western periphery, however, shows a different pattern. In the areas that would later become the heartland of the Western Scottish Gaelic tradition, the replacement was less complete. The Atlantic coastal ancestry persisted at higher frequencies in the Western Islands and peninsulas than elsewhere in the British Isles. This is consistent with the idea that the geographic remoteness and maritime orientation of these communities gave them some degree of protection from the full force of the demographic change that was sweeping through the continental, interior, and the more accessible parts of Britain. The steppe migrants came primarily from the east and the south. The western islands of Scotland were at the far end of the European peninsula. The migration reached them, but it reached them last, and perhaps with less force. What this means is that the Western Scottish populations that would later carry the Gaelic language, and then the Highland culture, and then the diaspora that spread Scottish identity around the English-speaking world, were not, genetically, simply descendants of the steppe migrants who brought the Proto-Celtic languages to Britain. They were a composite population in which a significant portion of the ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry, the ancestry shared with the Basques, persisted through the Bronze Age transformation. The Gaelic language was an Indo-European language brought from outside, but the people who came to speak it in the Western Highlands and Islands were, in significant part, biologically descended from the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of those shores. The language changed. The people, in some essential biological sense, did not change as much as the language might suggest. The Basques took a different path to the same outcome. The Basque Country was not outside the reach of the Bronze Age demographic changes. Steppe ancestry arrived there too. The Basques are not pure descendants of the Ice Age refugium population in any simple biological sense. But the frequency of steppe ancestry in the Basque population is lower than in the surrounding Iberian and French populations, just as the frequency of ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry is higher. The Pyrenean geography provided some protection, as the Western Scottish geography provided some protection to the Highland communities. And the Basque linguistic tradition, unlike the pre-Celtic traditions of the British Isles, survived in recognizable form despite the demographic pressures of the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. The result, in both cases, is a population that is genetically distinct from its neighbors in ways that reflect a greater retention of the ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry from the Ice Age refugium. And the specific marker that makes this distinct is, in both populations, the same Y chromosome lineage. The male line inheritance that runs from the Ice Age refugium survivors through the post-glacial Atlantic expansion, through the Neolithic megalith builders, through the Bronze Age transformations, through all the subsequent centuries of historical change, down to the men who are alive today in the Basque Country and the Western Scottish Highlands and wherever in the world their descendants have spread. That lineage does not know it is significant. It does not experience itself as an ancient survival. The men who carry it are simply living their lives, in whatever circumstances they find themselves, carrying in their cells a marker that they inherited from their fathers and that their fathers inherited from theirs, all the way back to a time when the world was a different place and the people who lived in it were different in ways that are now only visible through the particular lens of genetics. But the lineage is significant. It is one of the threads that connects the present to a past that would otherwise be entirely inaccessible. It is evidence of continuity in a part of the human story where continuity has often seemed impossible. The Ice Age refugium populations are not just history, they are ancestry. They are, in the most literal biological sense, the people some of us are descended from. And in the Basques and the Western Scots, that descent is more concentrated, more direct, more clearly visible in the data than anywhere else in Europe. The discovery of this connection was not made all at once. It emerged gradually, through the accumulation of genetic data collected from living populations over the course of 2 decades, and then through the ancient DNA revolution of the 2010s and 2020s, which allowed researchers to extract and analyze genetic material from skeletal remains that were thousands of years old. The ancient DNA data, in particular, transformed the understanding of European population history in ways that are still being fully absorbed. It confirmed things that the studies of living populations had suggested. It revealed things that no one had expected. And it placed the Basque-Scottish genetic connection in the context of a much larger story about the deep population history of Europe that is only now being fully told. The people who did the foundational genetic work on the Basque population were not primarily interested in the Basque-Scottish connection. They were interested in the Basques as a potential window into pre-Neolithic European genetic history. The Basques had been identified very early in the history of human genetics as an unusual population, and understanding why they were unusual was a priority for researchers who wanted to understand the overall population history of the continent. The Scottish connection emerged from those studies as one of the findings that demanded explanation. The explanation, once the post-glacial Atlantic expansion hypothesis had been developed, was elegant in the way that explanations that connect many separate observations tend to be elegant. It did not require any exotic mechanisms or improbable events. It did not require contact between the Basques and the Scots in historical times, which would have been surprising given the absence of any documented connection. It required only what the evidence of post-glacial Europe already suggested: that people spread northward along the Atlantic facade from the Iberian refugium as the ice retreated, and that the places where that expansion went deepest, the Atlantic periphery of the British Isles, retained the highest concentrations of the original refugium lineages. Elegant explanations are not always correct. Science has learned, over its history, to be suspicious of elegance as a criterion of truth. The history of genetics, in particular, is full of explanations that were elegant and then turned out to be wrong or incomplete when more data arrived. The ancient DNA revolution has revised, sometimes dramatically, the interpretations that had been built on the analysis of living populations. The picture of European population history that seemed clear in 2005 looked quite different by 2015 and has continued to evolve since then. But the core observation, the unusually high frequency of ancient Atlantic coastal lineages in both the Basques and the Western Scottish Highlands, has been confirmed by the ancient DNA data rather than contradicted. The ancient genomes from Neolithic Atlantic coastal sites, from the megalith builders of Ireland and Scotland and Brittany and the northern Iberian coast, show the same genetic profile that is most similar to the Basques among modern European populations. The connection is real. The explanation in terms of the post-glacial Atlantic expansion is the best currently available account of why the connection exists. And the story it tells, of survival in the Ice Age refugium and expansion along the Atlantic coast, and the persistence of that ancient lineage in the geographic periphery, is a story that will not go away. It will, however, continue to be refined. The ancient DNA field is producing new data at a rate that continues to accelerate. New techniques for extracting and sequencing ancient genetic material are opening up remains that were previously unusable. New analytical methods are providing more precise pictures of population structure and migration patterns. And new discoveries of ancient individuals whose genomes place them at key junctions in the story are regularly revising the timeline and the details of what happened in prehistoric Europe. Within that ongoing revision, the Basque-Scottish connection will be clarified further. The precise timing of the divergence between the populations that would become the Basques and the populations that would become the Western Scots will be better constrained. The extent to which they maintained contact and gene flow after the initial divergence will be better understood. The relationship between the Atlantic coastal genetic tradition and the megalithic cultural tradition will be more precisely mapped. And the ultimate fate of the non-Atlantic ancestry that has been incorporated into both populations over the millennia since the initial expansion will be traced in more detail. The story is getting richer, it is getting more specific, it is losing some of its broad brushstrokes and gaining the precision of a detailed portrait. And as it gains that precision, the essential observation at its core, that the Basques and the Western Scots share an ancient bloodline, because they are both, in significant part, the descendants of the people who survived the last ice age in the southwestern corner of Europe and then spread their lineages northward as the world warmed, becomes more firmly established, not less. That is the nature of genuine historical knowledge. It does not evaporate under scrutiny. It becomes clearer. The edges become sharper. The picture that emerges is recognizably the same picture that first emerged from the early genetic studies, but with more detail, more nuance, more confidence in the areas where the evidence is strongest, more appropriate uncertainty in the areas where it is still developing. The Basques and the Scots share a bloodline. They share it because of the ice, because of the survival in the refugium, because of the expansion along the Atlantic coast, because of the persistence in the geographic periphery of a lineage that the demographic transformations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age reduced, but did not eliminate in the places where the Atlantic tradition had its deepest roots. That is the answer to the question. It is an answer that took decades of genetic research and the ancient DNA revolution to fully establish. It is an answer that reaches back 12,000 years or more to account for a pattern that is still visible in living people today. And it is an answer that, once you understand it, makes the Basques and the Western Scots look different, not because their cultures or their histories have changed, But because the depth of their presence in their respective landscapes becomes visible, the Basques have been in their mountains not just since the Middle Ages or since Roman times, but since before farming arrived in Europe. The Western Scots have been on their Atlantic islands not just since the Gaelic expansion from Ireland, but since the post-glacial colonization of the British Isles by the descendants of the same Ice Age survivors. That depth is part of what you feel when you visit those places, if you have ever visited them. The sense that the land and the people have been in relationship for a very long time, that the particular quality of the Basque Country, the particular character of the Western Scottish Islands, is not just the product of recent history, but of something much older, something that reaches down to the bedrock of European human presence. The bedrock is old. It was laid down by survivors, and in the Basques and the Scots it is still there. There is a ferry that crosses the Bay of Biscay from Bilbao on the northern coast of Spain in the Basque Country to Plymouth on the southwestern coast of England. It is a long crossing, 30-some hours in each direction, and the bay itself is known for rough weather in the autumn and winter. But the route is one that has existed, in some form, since long before ferries. The Atlantic coast, from the Basque Country to the British Isles, is the route along which the post-glacial expansion moved, the route along which the megalith builders travelled, trading stone and ideas, and the genetic lineages that connect the two ends of the Atlantic facade. The route along which, in later historical times, Basque fishermen sailed to fish the rich waters of the North Atlantic, including the waters around the British Isles. The Basque fishing tradition is itself a piece of this larger story. Basque whalers and codfish hunters were ranging far into the Atlantic centuries before Columbus made his famous crossing. There is good evidence that Basque fishing vessels were reaching the Grand Banks of Newfoundland decades before 1492, following cod stocks across the western Atlantic, in pursuit of a resource that had been central to the Basque economy for generations. They came, they fished, they left very little trace, because their purpose was economic rather than colonizing, and they had every reason not to advertise their fishing grounds to competitors. But the linguistic traces they left in the indigenous communities of the Labrador coast, the maritime pidgin language called Basque Algonquin that developed between Basque fishermen and the Mi'kmaq people of northeastern North America, is a piece of evidence that the Basques were in the Western Atlantic early and regularly. This is relevant to the connection with Scotland because it illustrates the degree to which the Atlantic coastal tradition, of which both the Basques and the Western Scots were inheritors, was fundamentally maritime. These were not continental people who occasionally approached the sea. They were sea people for whom the ocean was a highway, a food source, a cultural medium, a relationship of the most intimate and ongoing kind. The Atlantic was not a barrier to the populations of the western coast. It was what connected them. It was what made the long continuity of exchange between the Iberian refugium descendants in the south and the Atlantic island communities in the north possible. The sea route between the Basque coast and the Irish and Scottish coasts is not a short one. In a prehistoric sailing technology, it would have been a significant undertaking. But it was not impossible. The Neolithic people who built the megalithic monuments of the Atlantic facade clearly had the maritime capability to maintain contact across those distances, because the cultural and genetic evidence of their connectedness requires it. They were not crossing the Atlantic in the sense of Columbus's crossing. They were moving up and down the Atlantic facade, following the coastal currents and the wind patterns and the seasonal rhythms of the sea that a maritime people would know intimately. The Basque fishing tradition of the historical period may be a continuation, in transformed and specialized form, of the maritime tradition that goes all the way back to the post-glacial Atlantic expansion. The specific boats, the specific techniques, the specific species targeted have all changed enormously over 12,000 years. But the basic orientation, the culture organized around the Atlantic, the knowledge and capability that makes the sea navigable rather than forbidding, may be one of the deepest continuities in the Basque cultural tradition. A thread running from the Ice Age survivors who followed the Atlantic coast northward, through the megalith builders who maintained the Atlantic network, through the medieval fishermen who ranged into the western Atlantic, to the modern Basques who still have a distinctive relationship with the sea. The Western Scots have their own version of this continuity. The culture of the Western Highland fishermen, the tradition of seamanship in the Hebrides and on the Atlantic-facing mainland, the stories of long voyages in small boats that are part of Gaelic oral tradition, All of these reflect the same fundamental orientation to the sea that the genetic and archaeological evidence associates with the ancient Atlantic coastal tradition. The Gaelic language overlaid the pre-Gaelic languages of the Western Islands, but the people who came to speak Gaelic in those islands were, in significant biological part, the same people who had been there before, and their maritime tradition was not a Gaelic import. It was an inheritance from the people who had been using those waters since the ice retreated. The oral traditions of both the Basques and the Western Scots are full of stories about the sea, about what lives in it and what comes from it, about the deep waters and what they contain, about storms and voyages, and the particular relationship between human beings and the ocean that a maritime culture develops over many generations of intimate engagement with it. These stories are not genetically transmitted, of course. They are cultural. They have changed over time in ways that the genetic lineages have not. The specific content of the stories that the Ice Age survivors told about the Bay of Biscay would be entirely unrecognizable to a modern Basque fisherman, just as the stories told by the first post-glacial inhabitants of the Scottish Islands would be unrecognizable to a modern Gaelic speaker. But the relationship to the sea that underlies those stories, the basic orientation of a people who live with the ocean as a constant presence, who name themselves partly in relationship to it, who understand their identity in maritime terms, is something that connects the stories of different periods, even when the specific content has been entirely transformed. It is one of those cultural continuities that persists not through explicit transmission, not through someone consciously deciding to pass on the ancient tradition, but through the simple, ongoing relationship between a people and a landscape, a people and a seascape, that changes slowly even when the explicit cultural content is changing rapidly. The genes and the sea and the language and the stories are all different ways of reading the same deep history. The genetic data gives you the population structure. The archaeology gives you the material culture. The linguistics gives you the cognitive structure. And the stories, the oral traditions, give you something that none of the others can quite provide, which is the lived experience of being these people, in this place, in relationship with this landscape over time. None of these ways of reading is sufficient by itself. The full picture requires all of them, working together, correcting each other's limitations and filling each other's gaps. The genetics tells you that the Basques and the Western Scots are related. The archaeology tells you that the Atlantic facade was a coherent cultural zone for thousands of years before recorded history. The linguistics raises the possibility that the languages spoken by those connected populations may have been related in ways that are now largely unrecoverable. And the stories, when they survive from enough separate traditions and show enough convergent features, suggest a shared imaginative world behind the separate cultural expressions. The convergent features between Basque and Scottish Gaelic mythology are interesting in this context, with all appropriate caution about the difficulty of distinguishing genuine historical connection from coincidental parallel development. Both traditions have rich traditions of supernatural beings associated with the sea. Both have stories about a time before the current age of the world that ended in catastrophe. Both have traditions of the dead crossing water to reach another world. Both preserve memory of a world profoundly organized around the cycles of the sun, the seasons, the agricultural and pastoral year, and the sea. These are all things that many European traditions share, because the underlying human experiences they address, death, the seasons, the sea, the supernatural, are universal. The convergences do not prove a specific historical connection, but they are consistent with a historical connection. And in the context of the genetic evidence, which is much more specific about the connection and much less susceptible to the alternative explanation of coincidental parallel development, the mythological convergences take on additional interest. If the people were related, then the possibility that their mythological traditions carry traces of a common ancestral tradition is not implausible. The specific forms of the myths may have changed enormously over 12,000 years. But deep structural features, the ways of categorizing the world and the supernatural and the relationship between the living and the dead, can persist in surprising ways even through enormous cultural change. The passage tomb tradition itself is a piece of this. The orientation of passage tombs to astronomical events, the use of the passage as a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the placing of the tombs in the landscape in ways that suggest they were understood as permanent presences in the world rather than simply as practical facilities for disposing of human remains. All of this reflects a way of thinking about death and the cosmos, and the relationship between generations that was shared across the Atlantic facade during the Neolithic period. It was not just a construction technique, it was a worldview, expressed in the most durable material available. That worldview is, in some form, part of the inheritance of both the Basques and the Western Scots. Not in the specific form it took in the passage tomb tradition, which is long gone as a living practice, but in some transformed and perhaps barely recognizable descendant form, in the relationship that these cultures maintain with their landscapes, with their dead, with the cycles of the year, and the movements of the sun and the sea. The specific beliefs have changed. The cultural forms have changed. The languages have changed, entirely in the Scottish case and somewhat in the Basque case, but the people have not changed as much as any of those things. And in the people, in the biological inheritance carried in their cells from the Ice Age survivors who first populated this Atlantic zone, there is a continuity that all the cultural changes have not broken. That is the most striking thing about the Basque-Scottish bloodline connection, not the genetics itself, which is a technical finding that requires a certain amount of scientific literacy to fully appreciate, but what the genetics implies about continuity, about the persistence of a people through the enormous transformations of the past 12,000 years. The Ice Age ended, the world warmed, sea levels rose and reshaped the coasts. Forests spread across what had been tundra. New people arrived, bringing farming and new languages and new genetic profiles. Empires rose and fell. Religions came and went. Wars reshaped the political landscape of the continent again and again. And through all of it, in the southwestern corner of Europe and in the northwestern corner of the British Isles, something persisted. The ancient lineage, the Atlantic orientation, the relationship with the landscape and the sea that goes back to the survivors. The Basques know something about persistence. They have maintained their language, their culture, their identity, through Roman conquest and Visigothic kingdoms and Frankish pressure and Castilian incorporation and Napoleonic reorganization and the particular pressures of two modern nation-states that have not always been comfortable with the Basque desire to be different. They have resisted, adapted, negotiated, and persisted. They are still there. They still speak Euskara. They still have their own culture, their own food, their own festivals, their own particular relationship with the landscape and the sea of their homeland. The Western Scots have their own version of this persistent story, the suppression of Highland culture after the Jacobite risings of the 18th century. The clearances that depopulated the Highland and island communities in the 19th century, driving enormous numbers of people off the land that their ancestors had been on since before recorded history. The slow decline of Scottish Gaelic as a community language under the pressure of English. And yet, Scottish Gaelic is still spoken. Highland culture is still alive. The connection to the Western landscape is still felt by people who have lived there for generations and by members of the diaspora who carry it in their DNA and their family memories wherever they have gone in the world. Both of these persistent stories are expressions of the same, deeper persistence. The persistence of the lineage from the Ice Age refugium, which has survived every demographic transformation of the past 12,000 years by virtue of the geographic protection offered by the Pyrenean Mountains in one case and the Atlantic Islands in the other. The cultural persistence is in some ways a reflection of the biological persistence, and the biological persistence is in some ways what has made the cultural persistence possible. People who stay in a place, who maintain a relationship with a specific landscape across generations, develop cultural traditions that are rooted in that place, in ways that are difficult to uproot, even when the pressures to change are enormous. The Basques stayed in their mountains. The Highland Scots stayed, in the face of everything that tried to remove them, on their Atlantic shores. And the lineage that connects them, the ancient signal from the Ice Age refugium, stayed with both of them. Through all the changes, through all the migrations and transformations and demographic upheavals of 12,000 years of European history, still present, still visible, still connecting two peoples who do not share a language or a recent history or a political tradition, but who share, in their cells, the memory of the ice. The memory of the ice. That is perhaps the most remarkable way to think about it. The Y chromosome haplogroup that connects Basque and Scottish men is not a memory in any conscious sense. The men who carry it do not know they are carrying it without a genetic test to tell them so. But it is, in a precise biological sense, a record of a specific line of male descent that runs, unbroken, from the Ice Age refugium to the present. Every man in that line is a link in a chain of survival that stretches back to the worst climate the planet has seen in human history. Every man in that line is the son of a man who survived, who found a mate, who had sons who survived, across 12,000 years of everything that the world could throw at them. That chain of survival is not trivial. The last glacial maximum was a genuine crisis for human populations in Europe. The total number of people who survived it in the refugia of southern Europe may have been in the tens of thousands. A small population, by any standard, clinging to the habitable margins of a frozen continent, maintaining their lineages through cold and scarcity and the particular pressures of life at the edge of survival. And from that small population, from those survivors of the ice, the bulk of the ancestry of modern Western Europeans eventually descended. The descendants of the Ice Age survivors are everywhere in Europe, but they are most concentrated, most directly represented in the Basques and the Western Scots. Those two populations are the places where the chain from the Ice Age to the present is shortest, most direct, least diluted by the subsequent waves of migration that added other lineages to the European genetic pool. They are the places where the memory of the ice is most legible in the genome, and they are, in a way that seems fitting given everything, also the places where the relationship with the landscape is most deeply rooted, most clearly expressed in cultural tradition, most resistant to the homogenizing pressures of the modern world. The Basques, with their language and their mountains. The Western Scots, with their Gaelic and their islands and their Atlantic, both of them holding on, as their ancestors held on in the refugium, to something that would be lost if they let it go. The holding on is the story. The survival is the story. And the shared bloodline is the evidence that the survival is real, that it is old, that it reaches back to a time before any name that either people has ever called themselves, to the cold and the dark of the Ice Age, and the small, warm refugium at the edge of the frozen world, where the people who would eventually become, among many others, the Basques and the Scots, kept the human fire alive. They kept it alive. It is still burning. In the Basque Country, and in the Western Highlands and Islands of Scotland, and in all the places in the world where the descendants of those ancient Atlantic survivors have carried their lineages and their cultures and their particular relationship with the sea and the mountains and the turning of the year. The fire is old, but it is not cold. It is still burning, in the people who carry it, in the places where it has been burning the longest. And tonight, wherever you are, whatever the time is, you have been in the presence of that fire, however briefly and at whatever remove. Sleep well, in whatever your own relationship to the ancient world might be. The Ice Age survivors would not have imagined you. But they survived, in part, so that something like you could eventually exist. That is what survival at the species level means. Not just the perpetuation of a lineage, the perpetuation of the possibility of a future, any future, including this one. Good night. The bloodline is old, and it is still here. The Cheddar Man is a name that most people in Britain have at least heard. He is a set of human remains found in Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge of Somerset, in the southwest of England, in 1903. The remains date to approximately 9,900 years ago, making him the oldest nearly complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. For most of the century after his discovery, he was a museum exhibit and an archaeological curiosity. But in 2018, a team of researchers from University College London and the Natural History Museum applied the full power of modern ancient DNA analysis to the Cheddar Man's genome, and what they found became an international news story. Cheddar Man, the oldest nearly complete Briton, had blue eyes and dark skin. His genetic profile placed him firmly within the Western hunter-gatherer population, the post-glacial European hunter-gatherers who were the descendants of the Ice Age refugium survivors. And his ancestry was most similar, among modern European populations, to the Basques, the man who had been lying in a Somerset cave for nearly 10,000 years, who had lived in Britain in the millennia before farming arrived on the island, before the Indo-European languages and the Bronze Age steppe ancestry transformed the British population, was genetically closer to a modern Basque person than to any other living European population. This was not a surprise to geneticists who had been studying the European refugium question. It was exactly what the models predicted. The Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain, the hunter-gatherers who colonized the island as the ice retreated, were the descendants of the post-glacial Atlantic expansion from the Iberian refugium. They were the Western hunter-gatherers, and the Basques are the modern European population that most closely resembles the ancient Western hunter-gatherer genome. Finding that Cheddar Man's ancestry matched the Basque profile better than any other modern population was the ancient DNA confirmation of what the living population genetics had been suggesting for years. But it was also more than a confirmation. It was a direct, personal, 9,900-year-old connection. A specific individual, lying in a specific cave in Somerset, whose genome was a time capsule from the moment before the great demographic transformations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age changed the population of Britain forever. He was, in the language of the genetics, a representative of the founding population of post-glacial Britain, the people who came first. The people who arrived when the ice retreated and the land was newly available and the sea levels were still low enough that Britain was only recently separated from the continent. The people who built the first culture of post-glacial Britain and who left in the bones of Cheddar Man a record that the DNA researchers of the 21st century could read. And what that record showed, when it was read, was the Atlantic coastal lineage, the refugium ancestry, the genetic profile shared with the Basques. Not with any other modern European population in such a clear and direct form, but with the Basques, which means that the oldest Britain we have ever been able to read genetically was, biologically, a kind of proto-Basque. A member of the same broad genetic tradition, carried to Britain by the post-glacial Atlantic expansion, that persisted in the Basque Country through all the subsequent demographic changes that replaced or diluted it almost everywhere else. The Cheddar Man story went viral because of the combination of the antiquity of the remains and the unexpected skin color finding. The dark skin of the Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers was a genuine surprise to most people, who had assumed that pale skin was an ancient European trait rather than a relatively recent adaptation to the lower light conditions of northern latitudes. But from a genetic history perspective, the most significant finding was not the skin color, it was the ancestry, the confirmation that the founding population of Britain was genetically most similar to the Basques. The confirmation, in ancient bone, of the connection that the living population genetics had been pointing toward for years. The implications of Cheddar Man's ancestry for the story of the Basque-Scottish connection are straightforward. If the founding population of Britain had Basque-like ancestry, and if the Western Scottish populations have retained more of that founding ancestry than most other British populations, due to their geographic peripherality and relative insulation from the Bronze Age demographic replacement, then the elevated frequency of ancient Atlantic lineages in the Western Scots is exactly what you would expect. The Western Scots are not anomalous. They are, in some sense, the most direct descendants of the people who were there first. The people like Cheddar Man, the people with the Basque-like ancestry from the Atlantic coastal expansion. The story that Cheddar Man's genome tells is also the story of loss, of what happened to the founding population of Britain in the millennia between his time and ours. The Neolithic farmers arrived from Anatolia and replaced most of his kind's ancestry in the genetic record of Britain. The Bronze Age steppe migrants arrived and replaced more. What was left of the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, of the Cheddar Man ancestry, of the Atlantic coastal refugium ancestry, was diluted again and again with each new wave of demographic change, until, in most of Britain, the proportion of that original ancestry is a minority fraction of the total genetic heritage. But in the Western Scottish Highlands and Islands, more of it survived. More of Cheddar Man's kind of ancestry is present in the Western Scots than in most other British populations. That survival is the connection. The connection between the Basques and the Western Scots is the survival of Cheddar Man's ancestry, or more precisely, of the ancestry that Cheddar Man represented, the post-glacial Atlantic coastal population whose genome was most similar to the Basques, in both the places where it was best protected from the subsequent demographic changes. The Basque Country, behind its Pyrenean mountains, and the Western Scottish Highlands and Islands, at the Atlantic edge of Britain, behind their sea. The sea, again, the sea is the constant in this story. The Atlantic, which was the highway of the post-glacial expansion and the trading network of the megalith builders and the fishing grounds of the Basque whalers, is also the protective barrier that allowed the ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry to survive in the places that faced it most directly. The people of the Atlantic orientation, who had built their cultures and their identities around the sea, were also the people most protected by the sea from the demographic transformations sweeping through the continental interior. The sea that was their resource and their highway was also their refuge. The Basques and the Western Scots both face the Atlantic. Both have built their cultural identities in significant part around that facing. And both have, because of that facing and the geographic protection it provided, retained more of the ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry than any other European populations. They share the bloodline because they both inherited it from the same ancestral population. And they retained it because they both lived in places where the sea provided the same kind of protection that it had always provided. Going back to the first post-glacial inhabitants who followed the Atlantic coast northward from the Iberian refugium, that is the complete story, as far as the genetics can tell it. But the genetics cannot tell everything. The genetics tells you about population structure and demographic change and the movement of lineages through time. It does not tell you about the people, about what they ate and what they believed and what they built and what they sang and what they told their children about the world they lived in. For those things you need the archaeology and the linguistics and the oral traditions and all the other ways of reading the past that genetics cannot access. The archaeology of the Western hunter-gatherers, the people of Cheddarman's kind, is a rich and complex story that is still being fully told. For a long time, the Mesolithic inhabitants of Europe were given relatively little attention by archaeologists compared to the dramatic material culture of the Neolithic that followed them. The Neolithic had the monuments and the pottery and the agriculture, the things that looked impressive in museums and that seemed to mark a decisive break with the more primitive past. The Mesolithic had, apparently, only flint tools and fish bones and not much else. But that picture was always incomplete, a function of what survives and what has been looked for rather than of what actually existed. The Mesolithic people of Western Europe were not simple. They were sophisticated foragers who had developed complex relationships with their landscapes over the many millennia of the post-glacial period. They had seasonal mobility patterns that took them across significant distances over the course of each year. They had exchange networks that moved raw materials and perhaps other goods over hundreds of kilometers. They had artistic traditions, though not on the monumental scale of the subsequent Neolithic. And they had, almost certainly, rich oral traditions, complex belief systems, and elaborate social practices that the archaeological record can only hint at. The coastal Mesolithic cultures of the Atlantic facade were particularly sophisticated. The Ertebole culture of the Danish coast and the Mouge Shell Midden cultures of Portugal were permanent or semi-permanent settlements with cemeteries and evidence of complex social organization. The shell middens of the Atlantic coast, the enormous heaps of shellfish remains that accumulated over generations of coastal habitation, are not just refuse piles. They are evidence of intensive use of coastal resources, of populations that had found in the rich marine environment of the Atlantic coast a resource base sufficient to support a degree of sedentism and social complexity that the traditional model of mobile hunter-gatherers did not accommodate. The Atlantic coast was a good place to be in the Mesolithic. The sea was full of fish and shellfish and sea mammals. The forests that were spreading across the newly ice-free land were full of game. The rivers that ran down to the coast were full of salmon and other anadromous fish. The people who had colonized this coast in the immediate post-glacial period, the descendants of the Ice Age refugium survivors who followed the Atlantic facade northward, had settled into a way of life that was genuinely successful. They were not desperate. They were not on the edge of survival. They were prosperous, in the terms that their economy defined prosperity and their populations were growing. The arrival of farming changed everything, not immediately, not everywhere at once, but over the course of the following millennia, the agricultural economy that spread westward and northward from Anatolia transformed the demographic landscape of Europe in ways that the genetic data has now documented precisely. The farmers displaced or replaced the hunter-gatherers. Their way of life, which could support much higher population densities on the same land area, ultimately overwhelmed the Mesolithic populations wherever the agricultural frontier advanced. The Atlantic coast was one of the last places the agricultural frontier reached in Western Europe, and when it did arrive, it seems to have arrived with less demographic force than in the continental interior. The coastal Mesolithic populations may have been better positioned to resist replacement, partly because of the richness of their marine resource base, which reduced the advantage that agriculture provided in inland environments, and partly because of the geographic character of the coast, its complexity of islands and peninsulas and inlets that made any uniform advance of population difficult. The Mesolithic ancestry survived more completely in the Atlantic periphery than in the continental interior, and the western Scottish highlands and islands at the extreme Atlantic periphery of the British Isles are where it survived most completely in the British context. The Basque Country retained the highest concentration in Iberia for the same combination of reasons. The Pyrenean Mountains made the Basque homeland relatively difficult to penetrate from the continental side. The Atlantic coast and its marine resources reduced the relative advantage of agriculture, and the local population may have adopted certain agricultural practices while retaining a larger proportion of its pre-agricultural genetic heritage than the surrounding populations that were more thoroughly replaced by the Neolithic demographic wave. These are not just matters of genetic curiosity. They have implications for how we understand the cultural traditions that have persisted in these regions. The Basque cultural tradition, including the language and the specific relationship to the landscape, and the particular social institutions that have characterized Basque society through the historical period, is not simply a medieval or a Roman period development. It has roots that go back through the Neolithic and into the Mesolithic, into the deep Atlantic coastal tradition of the people who were there before farming arrived. The Highland and Island Gaelic tradition of Western Scotland, similarly, is not simply a product of the Gaelic expansion from Ireland in the early medieval period. It was adopted by people who had been in those places since the post-glacial colonization, people who had a prior cultural tradition rooted in the Atlantic coast, and who incorporated the Gaelic language and elements of Gaelic culture into a way of life that was already ancient. The language changed, the culture adopted new elements, but the people, in significant biological part, were the same people who had been there before. And in the specific ways that the cultural tradition of a people reflects the relationship of those people to their landscape, both the Basque and the Western Scottish cultural traditions bear marks of their ancient Atlantic coastal heritage that the purely linguistic and historical analysis would not reveal. The food is one place where this shows up. Both the Basque Country and the Western Scottish Islands have food traditions that are profoundly shaped by the sea. The Basques are internationally recognized for their cuisine, which is extraordinary in its sophistication and its emphasis on fish and seafood and the particular flavors of the Atlantic coast. The Western Scottish Islands have their own, less internationally celebrated but equally distinctive food tradition, also organized around the products of the sea, around the particular fish and shellfish and seaweed and other marine resources that the Atlantic coast of Scotland provides. Food traditions are among the most conservative elements of culture. The specific ingredients that a culture works with are determined by the specific environment that culture inhabits, and those ingredients and the techniques for using them accumulate through generations of experience. A people who have been in relationship with a specific marine environment for a very long time develop a food tradition that reflects that relationship in detail. The Basque emphasis on cod and anchovies and salt cod and the particular fish of the Bay of Biscay is not a medieval invention. It has roots in the Mesolithic coastal adaptation of the Atlantic refugium descendants. The Western Scottish emphasis on herring and cockles and mussels and the other products of the Hebridean coast reflects a similarly ancient relationship with the specific marine environment of that coastline. Both traditions also share a relationship with preserved fish, with the ancient technology of salt curing and drying and smoking that allows the abundant harvest of the sea to be stored through the lean seasons. The salt cod tradition of the Basques, which drove their expansion into the North Atlantic in pursuit of the cod stocks of the Grand Banks, has a parallel in the herring curing traditions of the Western Scottish Islands that were economically central to the communities there until the 20th century. These are not the same tradition in any specific historical sense, but they reflect the same deep logic, a people with a maritime orientation, living in a seasonal environment, developing techniques for preserving the abundance of one season to sustain life through another. The sea, the fish, the preserved fish, the salt and the smoke, and the particular flavors of food prepared by people who know the sea intimately. These are among the sensory textures of cultures whose roots go very deep into the Atlantic coastal tradition. And they are, in their own way, part of what the ancient lineage has preserved. Not in the DNA, where the fish-preserving knowledge cannot be encoded, but in the cultural transmission, from parent to child, of the specific ways of doing things in this specific environment that have been developing since the first post-glacial settlers arrived on these coasts. The music is another place where the depth of the tradition shows up, if you know how to listen for it. Basque music has qualities that have been noted by ethnomusicologists as distinctive and difficult to fit into the patterns of European folk music more broadly. The modal structures, the rhythmic patterns, the particular character of the older forms, suggest a musical tradition with roots that predate the Roman and medieval cultural influences that shaped most European folk music. The Basque Zortziko, a musical form in a distinctive 5 to 8 time signature that has no clear parallel in any other European tradition, is a piece of evidence that the musical tradition of the Basques is genuinely old, in ways that go beyond what the historical documentation can reach. Scottish Gaelic music has its own distinctive character, its own modal structures and rhythmic forms, and particular qualities that set it apart from both the English folk tradition and the broader continental tradition. The Sean Nos, singing of the Gaelic tradition, the ornamented and melismatic style that is the most archaic form of Gaelic vocal music, has been compared by ethnomusicologists to other very old vocal traditions from the margins of Europe in ways that suggest it preserves features from a musical tradition that predates the Gaelic language itself. The form is Gaelic, but something in the musical structure may be older than the language, a trace of the pre-Gaelic musical tradition of the people who were in the Western Islands before the Gaelic expansion reached them. These are speculative observations. The history of music is extremely difficult to trace with any precision because music leaves no direct archaeological trace and because the oral transmission of musical tradition is subject to constant change. Making strong claims about the antiquity of specific musical features requires the kind of comparative evidence that is not always available, but the observations are worth noting. In the context of the broader genetic and archaeological evidence of the Atlantic coastal tradition, as one more indication that the shared heritage of the Basques and the Western Scots may run deeper than the genetics alone can show. The genetics shows the biological connection. The archaeology shows the shared material culture of the megalithic tradition. The linguistics raises the possibility of linguistic relationship in the pre-Indo-European period. And the cultural traditions, the food and the music and the relationship with the sea and the particular character of the connection to the landscape suggest a shared heritage of lived experience that reflects thousands of years of similar adaptation to the similar environments by people who share a significant portion of their biological ancestry. That shared heritage is not a simple or singular thing. It has been overlaid, in both cases, with enormous amounts of subsequent history. The Basques speak a language that may be very old, but that has undergone thousands of years of change and borrowing and evolution in contact with the surrounding Romance languages. The Western Scots speak an Indo-European language that arrived in their region about 1500 years ago, and that has itself undergone extensive change since then. The specific cultural forms of both traditions, the food, the music, the social institutions, the religious practices, the political structures, are products of a long and complex historical development that cannot be reduced to the Ice Age refugium and the post-glacial Atlantic expansion. But underneath all of that, in the biological substrate that the cultural traditions rest on, and in some of the deepest structural features of the cultural traditions themselves, there is a connection that goes back 12,000 years. A connection between people who survived the ice and their descendants who spread along the Atlantic coast, and the descendants of those descendants who built the megalithic monuments, and the descendants of those who eventually, after many generations and many transformations, became the people who call themselves Basque and the people who call themselves Scottish. They share a bloodline. The bloodline is old. And the fact that it is still visible, still measurable, still connecting these two populations across the width of the European continent and through 12,000 years of demographic change, is one of the most remarkable things that the science of ancient DNA has revealed about the human past. The human past is never as clean or as simple as the narratives we construct about it. The story of nations and peoples and cultures is always also, underneath, a story of biology, of lineages persisting and mixing and diverging and being carried by people who did not know they were carrying anything except their daily lives. The Basques, who go to their festivals and speak their ancient language and prepare their extraordinary food, are not, in any conscious sense, performing the legacy of the Ice Age refugium. They are simply living their lives, in the way that their parents and their grandparents and their great-grandparents lived their lives, in the place that their tradition has always known as home. The Western Scots, who maintain the Gaelic language and the traditions of the islands and the particular relationship with the Atlantic coast that is so central to the Highland and island identity, are not consciously performing the legacy of the post-glacial colonization. They are simply being who they are in the place where they have always been. But the legacy is there. It is in the DNA. It is in the cultural traditions. It is in the landscape itself, which the Atlantic coastal peoples have been shaping and being shaped by for 12,000 years. And it connects them, across everything that would seem to separate them, to each other. The Basques and the Scots share a bloodline no one else has. Now you know why. Sleep with that knowledge. The Ice Age is 12,000 years in the past, but its survivors are here. In the Basque Country and in the western Scottish Islands, and in all the places in the world where their descendants have carried the ancient lineage, the bloodline persists. The fire from the refugium is still burning, and tonight, you have been in its light. There is a word in Euskara, the Basque language, for the particular feeling of being in a high place and being able to see the sea. It is not a word that translates cleanly into English or French or Spanish. It names something specific, something that the Basque experience of landscape has found worth naming as a distinct concept. The high place and the sea, together, seen from the same standing point. That relationship between the elevation that lets you see and the sea that defines the horizon is specific enough to the Basque experience that it required its own word. That kind of specificity, the way a language names the exact combinations of experience that matter to its speakers, is one of the things that makes Euskara so interesting as a cultural artifact. The language has evolved in this specific landscape, the mountains above the Bay of Biscay, for so long that the landscape is inside the language in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from outside. Not just in the names of places, which any language accumulates over time in relation to the places its speakers inhabit, but in the basic vocabulary, the words for everyday things and experiences and relationships, which in Euskara carry the imprint of a very specific and very long-term relationship with a very specific kind of terrain. The Western Scottish Islands have a different language now than they had before the Gaelic expansion. The pre-Gaelic languages of those islands are gone, leaving only traces in the place names and in the occasional word that Scottish Gaelic seems to have borrowed from whatever was there before it. But Scottish Gaelic, in the Western Island context, has itself developed a relationship with the landscape that shows up in the language in ways parallel to what you find in Euskara. The vocabulary for sea conditions, for the specific states of the Atlantic in different weathers and seasons, is one example. The vocabulary for the particular quality of light in the Hebrides, the specific character of the landscape at different times of day and year, is another. Languages that have been spoken in a place for a long time accumulate the place in their vocabulary. Euskara has had longer, so it goes deeper. But the principle is the same. The people who speak a language in a place, over generations, find the words they need for the specific experiences that place provides. And when a language has been in a place long enough, the place is inside the language in ways that you can feel even without being able to fully articulate what you are feeling. This is one of the things that is at stake in the survival of both Euskara and Scottish Gaelic. Not just the survival of a communication system, a set of sounds and grammar rules that could theoretically be replaced by another, but the survival of the specific relationship between a people and a landscape that the language carries. The specific ways of seeing and naming the world that have developed over the long history of these languages in their places. When a language dies, that specific relationship dies with it. The landscape remains, but the particular human way of being in it that the language expresses is gone. Both Basque and Scottish Gaelic are endangered in the sense that the number of speakers of both languages is far smaller than it was in the past, and in both cases the dominant surrounding language, Spanish and English, respectively, exerts enormous pressure on speakers of the minority language. Both languages have seen significant revitalization efforts in recent decades. Basque has an official status in the Spanish Basque Country and a revitalized educational system that has produced a new generation of speakers. Scottish Gaelic is taught in schools and supported by public broadcasting, but both remain vulnerable, and the survival of both is far from certain. The genetic connection between the two peoples does not by itself tell us anything about what the linguistic survival of either language would require. Genetics and language are different things, connected historically but not deterministically. There are plenty of people who carry the ancient Atlantic coastal lineage but speak only English or Spanish because the language transmission was broken at some point in their family's history, even though the biological inheritance continued. And the survival of a language requires cultural commitment, educational infrastructure, economic incentive, and political support that genetic heritage cannot provide. But the genetic connection does tell us something about the depth of the stake. When the Basques defend Euskara, they are defending not just a language but the most direct surviving expression of a cultural tradition that goes back to the Ice Age. When Scottish Gaels maintain the language in the Western Islands and advocate for its recognition and support, they are maintaining a tradition that, while expressed in an Indo-European language that arrived relatively recently, is rooted in a relationship with the Atlantic coast that is among the oldest continuous human relationships with landscape anywhere in Europe. Both languages are worth defending on those grounds. Both carry, in different ways and to different degrees, the living expression of what the ancient Atlantic coastal tradition was and what it became. Both connect speakers to a depth of presence in their landscapes that no other language available to them in their contemporary contexts could provide. And both, in their specific ways of naming the world, carry the imprint of thousands of years of human experience in the places they belong to. That imprint is not retrievable through any other means. The genetics can tell you who the people were biologically. The archaeology can tell you what they built. But the language, the living language spoken by the people who are still there, is the only direct access to the specific human experience of being in these places across the deep time that the biology and the archaeology can trace. The Basques are still there. The Western Scots are still there. Their languages are still being spoken by fewer people than in the past, under pressures that were not present for most of the history of those languages. But they are still being spoken. And in the speaking, the ancient Atlantic coastal tradition maintains its most fragile and most direct living expression. That expression is worth everything that can be done to preserve it, not for reasons of nostalgia or romanticism, though those impulses are understandable, but for reasons of genuine human interest in the depth of the past. The languages are windows. They are the last living windows, in both cases, into a period of human experience on the Atlantic coast that stretches back to the ice. When they close, the windows close. The view they provided will not be available in any other form. The Cheddar Man did not speak Euskara. He did not speak Scottish Gaelic. He spoke something that predated both, something we can never recover. But the impulse that generated the languages he did speak, the specific human need to name the world in the particular ways that the specific landscape demanded, is the same impulse that generated Euskara and that generated the pre-Gaelic languages of the Western Scottish Islands, and that continues to generate the specific vocabulary of marine conditions and mountain light, and the particular feeling of standing in a high place and seeing the sea. That impulse is very old. It is as old as human language, and it is still at work, in the Basque Country and in the Western Scottish Islands, naming the world as it has always been named by the people who have been in those places for as long as there have been people in those places. The naming continues, the language continues, the bloodline continues, and tonight, in whatever quiet has settled around you, you have been part of the continuation, another mind that knows the story. Another link, however distant and indirect, in the chain that runs from the Ice Age to now. Sleep well. The names are still there. The words are still being spoken. The bloodline is still running. And the fire from the refugium, which was kept burning through the worst the planet could throw at a small population of survivors, is still burning. It was always going to last this long. They made sure of it. Good night. The Bay of Biscay has a personality. Anyone who has crossed it on the overnight ferry from Bilbao to England knows this. The bay is notorious for its weather, for the way the Atlantic swell comes in from the west without obstruction and meets the shallowing continental shelf and produces a particular kind of motion that is uncomfortable for most people on board. It is not always bad. In summer, in the right conditions, the crossing can be smooth enough. But the bay has a reputation for reason, and the reason is the specific oceanographic character of that corner of the Atlantic. The Basques know the bay intimately. They have been fishing it and sailing it and being shaped by it for as long as the Basque people have existed in recognizable form. Their knowledge of its currents and its weather patterns and its fish populations is not abstract knowledge. It is practical, embodied, accumulated through generations of engagement with the specific reality of those waters. And that knowledge is one of the things that enabled the Basque expansion into the North Atlantic that preceded Columbus by decades. The Grand Banks of Newfoundland were known to Basque fishermen. It is now generally accepted, well before the European exploration of the Americas began in the conventional historical narrative. The evidence is several kinds. There is the documentary evidence, the references in Spanish and French archives to Basque fishing voyages to codfish grounds that were clearly not in European waters, going back to the early decades of the 15th century. There is the material evidence, the remains of Basque whaling stations on the Labrador coast at Red Bay and elsewhere, that date to the mid-16th century, but that suggest an established industry, not a new one. And there is the linguistic evidence, the traces of the Basque Algonquin maritime pidgin that developed between Basque fishermen and the indigenous peoples of northeastern North America over what must have been many generations of contact before European colonization began in earnest. The Basque fishermen who were in Newfoundland waters in the 15th century were not exploring, they were working. They were following the cod to wherever the cod were abundant, using the maritime knowledge and the navigational capability that their tradition had been accumulating for generations. The North Atlantic was not a mystery to them. The ocean was their home. And the specific oceanographic conditions of the North Atlantic, the currents and the winds, and the particular patterns of the Gulf Stream and the Labrador Current that made the Grand Banks such an extraordinary fishing ground, were legible to people who had been reading the Atlantic for as long as the Basques had been reading it. This is the Atlantic coastal tradition in its most expansive historical expression. Not the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of 9,000 years ago, following the post-glacial coast northward. Not the Neolithic megalith builders, exchanging stone and ideas across the Atlantic facade, but the medieval Basque fishermen of the 14th and 15th centuries, ranging across the full width of the North Atlantic in pursuit of cod and whale, using a maritime knowledge that was the deep inheritance of the same tradition. The specific tools had changed enormously. The specific targets had changed, the social context was completely different, but the fundamental orientation, the relationship with the Atlantic as a navigable space rather than a barrier, the confidence in the sea that comes from being a people whose identity is organized around it, was the same, and the Western Scottish tradition has its own version of this expansiveness. The longships of the Norse who came to the Scottish islands in the 9th century were met by island people who were already experienced maritime navigators. The integration of Norse and Gaelic culture that produced the Gaul Guideheil, the mixed Norse-Gaelic population of the Western Islands, was possible partly because both cultures were maritime in a way that made their practical knowledge of the sea compatible. The Western Scottish Islanders did not learn seamanship from the Norse. They brought their own seamanship tradition to the encounter, a tradition that was already ancient by the Viking Age. The currach tradition, the small skin-covered boats that are one of the most archaic technologies of the Atlantic coast, preserved in the Irish and Scottish Gaelic cultural tradition into the modern era, is a piece of evidence for how old the Atlantic maritime tradition of these people is. The currach is not a sophisticated technology in terms of materials or construction, but it is an extraordinarily capable technology for the conditions of the Atlantic coast, flexible enough to ride seas that would swamp a rigid wooden hull, light enough to be carried by a small group, practical enough to be built and maintained by people without access to the specialized materials and skills that larger wooden boat building requires. It is the boat of people who have been intimately familiar with the specific conditions of the Atlantic coast for a very long time, who have found through trial and the accumulated experience of generations the form that best matches their specific needs in their specific environment. Both the Basque maritime tradition and the Atlantic Scottish maritime tradition are, in this deeper sense, expressions of the same ancient orientation. The specific forms are completely different. The historical contexts are completely different. But the underlying relationship with the Atlantic, the understanding of it as a navigable and productive environment rather than a dangerous boundary, is common to both. And that understanding goes back, if the genetic and archaeological evidence is correct, to the same ancestral tradition. The post-glacial expansion along the Atlantic coast, the Mesolithic maritime cultures of the Atlantic facade, the megalith builders who maintained exchange networks across the sea routes of the Western Atlantic, the people of the refugium who survived the ice and then, when the ice retreated, followed the coast northward and made it their home. The sea was always their home. The Basques and the Western Scots are the places where the sea most clearly remains home, in cultural memory and in the living traditions that have persisted through all the changes. The Atlantic is not just a geographic feature in those traditions. It is a relationship, a defining relationship, between a people and the body of water that has shaped them for longer than any history records. That relationship is itself part of the shared heritage, not the same relationship expressed in the same ways, but a relationship of the same fundamental kind, between people whose ancestors came from the same broad tradition and who found themselves in different places and different times, maintaining versions of the same fundamental orientation to the Atlantic that the tradition had always had. It is late now. The ocean is out there somewhere, dark and moving, indifferent to our stories about it. The Basque fishing boats are at their moorings in Hondarribia and San Sebastian and the other harbours of the coast. The creels are lying on the pier at Tarbert and Stornoway and the other fishing harbours of the western Scottish islands. The fish are in the sea is in the dark. And the stars, the same stars that the Ice Age survivors looked up at from their refugium on the edge of the frozen world, are overhead. The bloodline persists. The tradition persists. The relationship with the sea persists. And somewhere in the long human story that connects the Ice Age to now, the Basques and the Western Scots are the places where the thread has been longest and least broken. Sleep now. The sea knows nothing about any of this. But you do. And that is enough for tonight. Good night, from the Atlantic coast. From the Ice Age to now, the bloodline is still running. Rest well. The stone circles of the Atlantic coast are among the most enduring physical expressions of the tradition we have been following through the genetics and the language and the maritime culture. Standing stones and stone circles appear across the entire Atlantic facade, from the Algarve coast of southern Portugal to the northernmost islands of Orkney, in a distribution that closely tracks the genetic distribution of the ancient Atlantic coastal ancestry. They are most numerous and most elaborate in the places where that ancestry is strongest. The Breton megaliths of Carnac, with their extraordinary alignments of standing stones stretching for kilometres across the Morbihan landscape, the great passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, the stone circles of the Hebrides, of which the Callanais stones on the Isle of Lewis are the most famous. And in the Basque Country, the less celebrated but genuine megalithic tradition of the Basque Mountains, the dolmens and cromlechs of the Pyrenean foothill zone. The Basque megalithic tradition is not as well known internationally as the Irish or the Breton, partly because the Basque monuments are smaller in scale than the Great Passage tombs, and partly because they have received less scholarly attention and less popular coverage. But they exist, and they are genuine, and they place the Basque Country firmly within the Atlantic megalithic tradition that the genetic evidence connects to the ancient refugium lineage. The Basque cromlechs, small stone circles typically 6 to 15 meters in diameter, are found in significant numbers in the high mountain pastures of the western Pyrenean foothills. Some of them have been dated through associated burial material to the Bronze Age, and some are associated with later Iron Age use. But the tradition of building stone circles in the Basque Mountains is old, and some researchers have suggested that at least the earliest examples belong to a Neolithic tradition continuous with the Atlantic megalithic tradition of the broader Atlantic coastal zone. The cromlechs are not dramatic in the way that Stonehenge is dramatic. They are small, intimate, set in pastoral landscapes of summer grazing that have been in use since the Bronze Age or earlier. They feel old in the way that very old things that have been in one place for a very long time feel old. not imposing, present, part of the landscape in a way that is different from something placed in the landscape recently. They have had time to belong. The Calanais stones on Lewis feel the same way, at a much larger scale. The Calanais complex, which consists of a central circle of tall, slender stones, surrounded by multiple alignments extending in different directions, is one of the most atmospheric prehistoric monuments in the British Isles. It sits on a peninsula overlooking the sea, and its orientation incorporates the movement of the moon against the silhouette of the hills to the south in a way that required sophisticated astronomical knowledge to design. The people who built it understood the lunar cycle with a precision that required generations of observation and the cultural infrastructure to transmit those observations accurately. The cultural infrastructure. That is what the megalithic tradition, in all its forms, required. Not just the physical labor to move the stones, though that was enormous. Not just the astronomical knowledge to plan the alignments, though that was sophisticated, but the cultural continuity to maintain the tradition across many generations, to pass on the knowledge of why these places mattered and how they were to be maintained and used, to ensure that each generation understood its role in the ongoing relationship between the living community and the places of the dead and the sky and the turning year. That cultural continuity is the thing that most connects the Basque cromlechs and the Calanais stones and all the other monuments of the Atlantic megalithic tradition to the deeper genetic story we have been following. The physical monuments express the same underlying relationship with the landscape and the sky that the genetics traces back to the Atlantic coastal tradition from the Ice Age refugium. The specific forms vary enormously between the Portuguese dolmens and the Irish passage tombs and the Breton alignments and the Scottish stone circles and the Basque cromlechs, but the underlying impulse, to mark the landscape in ways that endure, to align the marks to the movements of the sky, to use the durable medium of stone to create a permanent record of the human relationship with place and cosmos, is recognizably the same across the entire tradition. That recognizable sameness across an enormous geographic range is what makes the Atlantic megalithic tradition such important evidence for the cultural coherence of the post-glacial Atlantic coastal population. These were not independent local inventions of a monumental tradition. The similarities are too consistent, the alignments too similar, the construction techniques too parallel. These were people in contact with each other, sharing ideas and techniques and perhaps beliefs across the sea routes of the Atlantic. They were a connected community, and the monuments are the physical record of that connection. The genetic record confirms the connection from a different angle. The people who built these monuments shared ancestry. They were, in a real and demonstrable biological sense, related. Not as closely related as siblings or cousins, but as the descendants of a common ancestral population, the post-glacial Atlantic coastal expansion from the Iberian refugium, who had diverged and developed local traditions over the millennia, but who maintained enough contact to share the broad outlines of a monumental tradition. The Basques are the descendants of the southernmost part of that tradition. The Western Scots are the descendants of one of the northernmost parts. And the Calanais stones and the Basque cromlechs, different as they are in scale and form, are both expressions of the same ancient human impulse, carried by the same ancient lineage, expressed in the specific way that the specific landscape and climate and cultural context of each place allowed. Standing at Calanais at dusk, when the light is low and the stones cast long shadows across the short Hebridean grass, it is possible to feel the weight of the tradition behind the monument without knowing any of the genetic or archaeological details. The place has that quality that the very old places have. The sense that many people have stood here before, in many different conditions and for many different purposes, and that their presence has accumulated in the stones and the ground in some way that is not fully explicable, but that is genuinely felt. Standing in a Basque cromlech in the high mountain pastures at the end of a summer day, when the light is going gold over the Pyrenean ridge and the sheep are moving down to their lower pasture, and the air has the particular smell of late summer in those mountains, is a different experience, in a different landscape, with different sounds and different light. But there is something in common, the same accumulation of time, the same sense of the very old, the same quality of a place that has been known and used and returned to by human beings for so long that the human presence has become part of what the place is. That commonality is the deep heritage. The The specific monuments are different. The specific landscapes are different. The specific cultures that have inhabited those landscapes in the millennia since the stones were placed are different in almost every particular. But in the relationship between the people and the place, in the particular quality of presence that comes from a very long and continuous human engagement with a specific piece of earth, there is something shared, something that goes back to the common ancestry, something that was carried by the descendants of the Ice Age refugium survivors as they spread northward along the Atlantic coast and established the communities that would, in time, build both the colonized stones and the Basque cromlechs. That shared something is not easily named in any modern language. It is a quality of being in a place, of knowing a place in the way that comes from many generations of relationship with it. It is the kind of knowledge that the Basque language seems to have developed special vocabulary for, the specific combination of elevation and sea view that required its own word. It is the kind of knowledge that the pre-Gaelic languages of the Western Scottish Islands must also have had specific vocabulary for, vocabulary that is now gone because the languages that held it are gone, but whose traces can perhaps be felt in the particular way that Scottish Gaelic speakers describe their landscape. The knowledge of being in a place for a very long time, that is the deepest inheritance. The genetic lineage is the biological record of it. The megalithic monuments are the material record. The language, in the Basque case, is the linguistic record. And the sense of deep belonging that both Basques and Western Scots often describe in relation to their specific landscapes is the experiential record, the felt quality of the long relationship expressing itself in the present. We cannot fully recover the specific content of the tradition that the Ice Age refugium survivors passed on. We cannot know what they believed about the world or how they organized their social lives or what they called themselves or their landscape. What we can know is that they survived, that their descendants spread northward along the Atlantic coast, that those descendants built the megalithic monuments and maintained the Atlantic network, and eventually, after many transformations, became the people who are now the Basques and the Western Scots. And that the connection between those two modern populations, the shared bloodline that no other populations between them share in the same degree, is the most direct evidence we have of the deep continuity of the Atlantic coastal tradition. That continuity is not just a historical curiosity, it is a living reality. The Basques are still in their mountains. The Western Scots are still on their Atlantic islands. The languages, under pressure but not gone, are still being spoken. The relationship with the sea is still defining, in cultural memory and in the practical lives of the people who remain in those places. And the ancient lineage, the Y chromosome marker from the Ice Age refugium, is still being passed from father to son in both populations, as it has been passed, unbroken, for 12,000 years. 12,000 years. In that span of time, civilizations have risen and fallen and been replaced and forgotten. Languages have been born and died and been replaced and forgotten. The Roman Empire rose and fell. The medieval kingdoms rose and fell. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world. And through all of it, in the Basque Mountains and on the Scottish Islands, the ancient lineage persisted. It will persist longer. The Basques and the Western Scots are not finished. The forces that have pressured them are real, and they have done real damage to the population numbers and to the language vitality and to the cultural coherence that has always been the living expression of the tradition. But the people are still there. The languages are still being spoken. The children are still being born who will carry the lineage forward. The Ice Age survivors were in a more desperate situation than anything the Basques or the Western Scots have faced in recorded history. They survived anyway. They kept the lineage going through conditions that we cannot fully imagine. And their descendants, 12,000 years later, are sitting in Bilbao and Stornoway and San Sebastian and the houses of the Hebrides, living their lives, speaking their languages where they still can, maintaining their relationships with the landscapes and the seas that their tradition has always known. That is a story worth knowing, worth carrying, worth passing on, in whatever form and to whatever future is coming. Tonight, you know it. Sleep with it. The bloodline is old, the tradition is deep, and the people who carry it are still here. Good night. The Ötzi discovery in 1991 changed something in how people thought about ancient Europeans. Ötzi was found in the Alps on the border between Austria and Italy, preserved in a glacier for 5,300 years, his body so complete that researchers could determine not just his genetics, but what he had last eaten, what diseases he had, and that he had been murdered, shot from behind with an arrow. He was a Neolithic man. He lived in the period of the Great Atlantic megalithic tradition, when the farmers who had come from Anatolia were spreading across Europe, and when the culture that built Stonehenge and the Irish Passage tombs was at or near its height. When Ötzi's genome was fully sequenced, his ancestry placed him among the early European farmers, the Anatolian-derived population that had arrived in Europe several thousand years before his time, and had largely replaced the older Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the continental interior. This was expected. The Alps in the Neolithic period were within the zone where the farming expansion had been thorough. What was perhaps more interesting was where Ötzi's ancestry did not place him. He had very little of the ancient Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, the refugium ancestry shared by the Basques and the ancient Britons like Cheddarman. The farming expansion had been almost complete in his region. The old lineage was gone, replaced by the new. This contrast between Ötzi and Cheddarman illustrates the geographic gradient of the Atlantic coastal ancestry preservation across Europe. In the continental interior, even at a relatively early date, the old lineage had been largely replaced by the farming-associated ancestry. At the Atlantic periphery, as late as the Neolithic and Bronze Age, the old lineage persisted at much higher frequencies. The gradient runs from the interior, where replacement was most complete and earliest, to the Atlantic edge, where it was least complete and latest. And the modern populations at the extreme Atlantic edge, the Basques and the Western Scots, retain the highest frequencies of the old lineage, precisely because they are at the extreme Atlantic edge, where the replacement was least thorough. Ötzi is important for another reason in this context. He is one of the first ancient individuals whose genome was used to make statements about the deep history of European populations. His genome helped establish the picture of European population history as involving three major ancestry components: the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, the old refugium lineage, the early European farmer ancestry, the Anatolian-derived component, and the steppe ancestry, the component associated with the later Indo-European language expansion. Modern Europeans are mixtures of these three components in varying proportions, and the proportions of the mixture vary systematically with geography in ways that reflect the different intensities and timings of the various demographic expansions. The Basques and the Western Scots are not exceptions to this three-component model. They have all three components in their genomes, but the proportions are different from the European average, specifically in the direction of a higher-than-average contribution from the Western hunter-gatherer component, the ancient refugium ancestry. And it is that specific difference, the elevated Western hunter-gatherer fraction relative to surrounding populations, that is the genetic basis of the Basque-Scottish bloodline connection. The genomics of this is fairly precise. When researchers calculate the genetic distance between modern European populations and ancient genomic reference populations, the Basques consistently show the highest similarity to the Western hunter-gatherer ancient genomes of any modern European population. The Western Scottish populations show the highest similarity among British and Irish populations. And when you calculate the genetic similarity between the Basques and various modern European populations, the Western Scottish populations show up among the most similar, even though they are geographically distant, because they share the same elevated Western hunter-gatherer component. The math of population genetics is not the most immediately engaging content in the world, but the picture it paints, when translated into the terms of the story we have been telling, is compelling. Two populations, separated by the width of the European continent, share an ancient bloodline because they both inherited it from the same ancestral source, and both managed to retain it, through the demographic transformations of the Neolithic and Bronze Age, in higher proportions than the populations between them. The connection is not coincidental, it is not metaphorical, it is biological, specific, and measurable. The measurement is what makes this story different from the many other stories of mysterious connections between ancient peoples that populate the literature of alternative history and popular archaeology. Most of those stories rest on suggestive similarities, architectural parallels, mythological convergences, coincidences of place name, the kind of evidence that is interesting but not conclusive. The Basque-Scottish bloodline story rests on something harder, on the actual sequence of the actual DNA, in the actual cells of actual people. The genetics does not prove everything about the story. It does not tell us what language the Ice Age survivors spoke, or what they believed, or how they organized their social lives. But it proves the demographic connection, and the demographic connection is the foundation on which all the rest of the story rests. That foundation is solid. It has been confirmed by multiple independent research groups using different samples and different analytical methods across more than 2 decades of genetic research. It has been refined and nuanced by the ancient DNA data. It fits within a coherent model of European population history that also explains dozens of other patterns in the genetic and archaeological record. It is not a fringe claim. It is a well-established finding in population genetics, recognized as such by the mainstream scientific community. What is perhaps less well recognized is the human story that the finding implies. The scientific papers establish the connection. They quantify the shared ancestry and place it in the framework of European population history. But they do not, typically, pause to consider what it means that 2 populations, separated by the width of a continent, share this ancient bloodline. What it means for how we understand the deep human presence on the Atlantic coast. What it means for how we understand the Basques and the Western Scots themselves, their long histories in their respective landscapes, their cultural traditions and their languages, and their particular relationships with the sea. Those implications are the part of the story that deserves more attention than it has received. The genetics provides the evidence. The story is what the evidence points to. And the story, as we have been following it through the Ice Age refugium and the post-glacial expansion and the megalithic tradition and the maritime cultures and the language and the oral traditions, is one of the most remarkable stories in European prehistory. It is a story of survival, of the specific kind of survival that the human species is capable of when circumstances are most extreme. Not just physical survival, though that is the foundation, but cultural survival, the survival of a relationship with a landscape, of a way of being in the world, of a tradition of looking up at the sky and finding it meaningful and worth marking in stone, that persisted through 12,000 years of climatic change and demographic transformation and cultural disruption. The markers of that survival are everywhere, if you know how to see them. In the genetic data, in the megalithic monuments, in the language, in the Basque case, still being spoken, in the cultural traditions of both peoples, in the particular quality of being in the places where the tradition has been longest, the Basque Mountains above the Bay of Biscay and the Atlantic-facing islands of Western Scotland, where the landscape and the people have had time to know each other in the deep way that long familiarity produces. The Basques and the Scots did not choose to share a bloodline. They did not know they shared it until the science of genetics made it visible. They have lived their separate histories, in their separate places, speaking their separate languages, maintaining their separate cultural traditions, for all of recorded history without any particular awareness of the specific biological connection that runs between them. But the connection is there. It was always there. It was there when the Basque fishermen were ranging into the North Atlantic in pursuit of cod, unaware that the people of the Scottish islands, though they spoke a different language and lived a different life, carried in their Y chromosomes the same ancient marker. It was there in the Bronze Age, when the descendants of the megalith builders were being reshaped by the steppe migration in most of Europe, while the Basques and the Western Scots retained more of the old ancestry. It was there in the Ice Age, when the survivors in the southwestern refugium were the ancestors of both the people who would stay and become the Basques and the people who would move north and eventually become, among many others, the pre-Gaelic inhabitants of the Scottish Islands. The connection has always been there. We are the first generation to be able to see it clearly. The science that made it visible is recent. The evidence that confirms it has been accumulating for only a few decades. And the full human story of what the connection means, of what it tells us about the deep history of the Atlantic coastal tradition, is still being assembled. That assembly will continue. The ancient DNA field is producing new data constantly. New research programs are studying the Mesolithic and Neolithic populations of the Atlantic coast in more detail than ever before. New analytical methods are allowing more precise reconstruction of the demographic history of specific populations. and the growing collaboration between genetic research and indigenous and regional communities, including the Basques and the Scottish Gaelic communities, is beginning to produce research that is more attentive to the human and cultural dimensions of the genetic findings. The picture will get richer, the story will get more detailed, the specific mechanisms of how the Atlantic coastal tradition developed and spread and persisted will become clearer, and the particular reasons why the Basques and the Western Scots retained more of the ancient lineage than anyone between them will be better understood. But the core finding will not change. The Basques and the Western Scots share a bloodline because of the Ice Age, because of the survival in the refugium, because of the post-glacial expansion along the Atlantic coast, because of the persistence of the ancient lineage in the geographic periphery, where the subsequent demographic transformations were least thorough. That is the answer. It has been established by the science. And the human story it implies, of survival and expansion and persistence across 12,000 years of everything that the planet and human history could throw at a lineage, is one of the most remarkable stories that the science of genetics has produced. You know that story now. You have followed it from the Ice Age to the modern populations, from the genetics to the language to the archaeology to the maritime traditions to the standing stones. You know why the Scots and the Basques share a bloodline no one else has. And, in the way that knowing a deep story changes how you see the surface, that the Basque speaker and the Scottish Gaelic speaker are not just two minority language communities in the northwestern corner of Europe. They are the living endpoints of a tradition that reaches back to the most extreme climate crisis of the human era and that has never fully stopped running. That tradition is running tonight, in the genes of people who do not know they carry it, in the languages of people who are still speaking the most ancient tongues of the Western world, in the places that have been known and inhabited and named by the descendants of the Ice Age survivors for longer than any history records. Sleep with that knowledge. It is very old knowledge, but it is new to you tonight. And tomorrow, when you wake, the Basque Mountains and the Scottish Islands will still be there, and the people who have always been there will still be there, and the bloodline will still be running. It was always going to outlast any particular night. It has outlasted 12,000 years of them. Good night. The Mesolithic people of the British Isles left behind relatively few traces that have been well studied. Compared to the Neolithic, which produced the megalithic monuments and the evidence of farming that archaeologists find relatively easy to work with, the Mesolithic material culture is subtle and requires careful attention to find and interpret flint scatters, bone deposits, the remains of shellfish middens at coastal sites, the occasional personal ornament or worked antler tool. These are not the dramatic artifacts that end up on the covers of popular archaeology magazines. They are the quiet, easy-to-overlook evidence of people who had not yet developed the kind of material culture that endures, obviously, in the archaeological record. But the quiet evidence, when it is found and carefully analyzed, tells a story of people who were sophisticated in their adaptation to the Atlantic coastal environment and who were in contact with each other across significant distances. The raw materials found at Mesolithic sites in Scotland were sometimes sourced from considerable distances. Flint from specific outcrops on the coast of Antrim in Northern Ireland turns up in sites on the west coast of Scotland, demonstrating that the short crossing of the North Channel was a regular part of the Mesolithic people's movement through their world. Perforated shells that may have been used as ornaments in necklaces or other personal adornment show up at sites from one end of the Atlantic coast to the other in forms that suggest a shared aesthetic tradition. The shared aesthetic tradition is significant. When people in distant locations are independently producing objects of similar form and function for personal adornment, either they are responding to universal human impulses that just happen to converge on similar forms, which is possible, or they are in contact, exchanging ideas and perhaps the objects themselves, which creates a cultural convergence through communication rather than through coincidence. The Mesolithic evidence from the Atlantic coast leans toward the second interpretation. The similarities are too consistent, the raw material exchanges too well documented, for pure coincidence to be the best explanation. The people who were exchanging raw materials and ideas across the Atlantic coast in the Mesolithic were the descendants of the post-glacial expansion from the Iberian refugium. They were the Western hunter-gatherers, the people whose genetic profile is most similar to the modern Basques. And they were doing in the Mesolithic what their descendants would do on a much larger scale in the Neolithic. maintaining a network of contact and exchange along the Atlantic coast that connected the southernmost populations with the northernmost in a coherent cultural zone. The Mesolithic Atlantic network was the precursor to the Neolithic megalithic tradition. The same roots, the same populations, the same underlying cultural orientation to the sea as a connective medium rather than a barrier. What changed in the Neolithic was the scale and the permanence of what the network produced. The megalithic monuments are the most visible result of the Neolithic intensification of the Atlantic coastal tradition. But the tradition itself, the network of contact and exchange and shared cultural practice along the Atlantic facade, was already in place in the Mesolithic. And its roots go further back still, into the period immediately following the last ice age, when the first post-glacial settlers were colonizing the newly available land of the Atlantic coast. Those first settlers were not building stone circles. They were finding shelter and food, establishing the basic patterns of resource use that would sustain their descendants for thousands of years. But they were already, by the evidence of the places they chose to settle, orienting themselves to the coast, to the sea, to the particular relationship between the Atlantic and the land that the geography of the Western European coast creates. That orientation was not accidental. It was the product of survival. The people who came through the Ice Age in the Iberian refugium had been in close relationship with the Atlantic coast for tens of thousands of years. The Bay of Biscay, coast of northern Spain and southwestern France, where the refugium was centered, is defined by its relationship to the Atlantic. The climate is Atlantic. The resources of the coast and the sea were central to the subsistence economy of the refugium population. The people who emerged from the refugium as the ice retreated were already Atlantic people. They already understood the sea. They already had the cultural tools and the practical knowledge to use it. And when they moved north along the coast, following the resources of the Atlantic and the coastal forests as they spread northward with the warming climate, they brought that understanding with them. The northward expansion is one of the most dramatic demographic events in European prehistory. Even though it left a relatively quiet material trace, it was not an army. It was not a migration of thousands marching northward in a single event. It was generations of small groups moving incrementally, generation by generation, following the receding glaciers and the expanding forests and the newly available coastal resources. Over hundreds of years, the descendants of the refugium survivors reached the English Channel, crossed it when sea levels were still low enough to make the crossing easy, and colonized the newly available land of the British Isles. They continued northward, reaching Ireland and eventually Scotland, including the westernmost islands that the sea and the difficult terrain of the Highlands made the last parts of Britain to be fully colonized. In the western islands of Scotland, the newcomers found a world of extraordinary maritime richness. The Hebridean seas, warmed by the Gulf Stream, are among the most productive in the North Atlantic. The coastlines are complex, with countless sheltered inlets and sea locks where fish and shellfish are abundant. The islands are large enough to support substantial populations, but separated from the mainland in ways that give them a degree of isolation and self-sufficiency. And the landscape, while demanding, is not uninhabitable. The western islands and peninsulas of Scotland offered a good life to people with the maritime skills to exploit their resources. The post-glacial settlers of the western Scottish islands had those skills. They came from the Atlantic coastal tradition. They were the people for whom the sea was home, and they found, in the western Scottish islands, an environment that matched the resources and the demands of the Atlantic coastal tradition almost perfectly. The sea, the coast, the fish, the shellfish, the particular rhythm of the Atlantic seasons that determined when to fish and when to hunt and when to gather and when to move. They stayed. They built a life. They accumulated, over the many generations that followed the initial colonization, the deep knowledge of the specific landscape and sea that the Western hunter-gatherer tradition was good at producing. And they passed that knowledge on, to their children and their grandchildren, and all the subsequent generations, through the Ice Age survivors' most effective technology for transmitting knowledge across time: oral tradition, the telling of stories, the singing of songs that encoded information about the landscape and the seasons and the resources and the relationships between people and places that sustained life in the Western Islands. The songs are gone, in the specific form they had in the Mesolithic. The stories are gone. The specific knowledge of the specific landscape that the Western hunter-gatherer tradition of the Western Scottish Islands had accumulated over thousands of years of occupation is gone, or transformed beyond recognition into the Gaelic cultural tradition that eventually absorbed and replaced the pre-Gaelic tradition in those islands. But the people are not gone. The biology is not gone. The Y chromosome marker that runs from the Ice Age refugium through the post-glacial expansion, through the Mesolithic settlement of the Western Islands, through all the subsequent transformations to the men of the Highland and Island communities today is not gone. It is carrying, in its chemical structure, the record of every generation of transmission, every father who had a son, every son who grew up and had sons of his own, every man in the Western Scottish tradition who was part of the continuous chain from the first post-glacial settlers to the present. That chain is unbroken. The record is continuous. And it connects, without interruption and without dilution, in the specific male line marker, to the Ice Age refugium and the people who were there, and the great adventure of the post-glacial expansion that spread their lineages north along the Atlantic coast. The Basques have the same chain, running in the opposite direction. Not northward, but staying in the place where the chain began, in the Pyrenean foothills above the Bay of Biscay, where the refugium was centred and where the descendants of the survivors have been ever since. The chain in the Basque Country is perhaps even less diluted than the chain in the Western Scottish Islands, because the Basques stayed in the place the chain started, rather than expanding away from it. Their Y chromosome marker is the original. The Western Scottish marker is the copy that travelled north. Both the original and the copy are valid. Both connect their carriers to the Ice Age survivors. Both mark their bearers as part of the long, unbroken tradition of the Atlantic coastal peoples. And both persist, in populations that do not know they share them, in countries that have no official relationship with each other, in cultures that have been separate for longer than any history records. That is the mystery that the genetics resolved, not by making it less mysterious, but by making it specific. The Basques and the Western Scots share a bloodline. Now you know exactly what that means, and why, and how old it is, and what it implies about the deep history of the people who carry it. The mystery is deeper once you know the answer, not shallower. The answer reveals a story so much longer and more complex than the surface question implied. The genetics connects the living people to the Ice Age. The Ice Age connects the living people to a world so different from the present that the imagination strains to contain it. The glaciers, the tundra, the small population of survivors in the refugium, the slow warming, the northward expansion, the megaliths, the maritime networks, the Bronze Age transformation, the Celtic languages, the Norse, the medieval kingdoms, all of it on top of, and in some degree in tension with, the deep continuity that the ancient lineage represents. The lineage is a thread running through all of that, carrying the connection from the Ice Age to the present, connecting the Basques to the Western Scots across every historical change that separated them, persisting in the geographic periphery while the demographic transformations of the last 10,000 years remade the populations of the continental interior. It is a remarkable thread, 12,000 years long, at minimum, possibly longer if the refugium population was itself descended from earlier European hunter-gatherers who had been in the southwestern corner of the continent since even before the last glacial maximum. The thread goes back as far as the evidence can currently trace it, and the evidence suggests it goes back a long way. Tonight, the thread is still running. In the Basque Country and in the Western Scottish Islands and in the diaspora populations around the world who carry the lineage wherever they went, the thread will keep running. It has survived everything so far. There is no reason to think it will not survive everything yet to come. Sleep now. The thread is running. The bloodline is old. And the story, which started in the Ice Age and is still being told, will keep going long after tonight. Good night. From the refugium, through the millennia, to wherever you are right now. The thread connects you to all of it. Not biologically, perhaps, but in the knowing, in the having heard, in the carrying of the story forward into whatever comes next. That is a kind of connection too. Good night. There is a painting in the caves at Altamira that most people who have seen photographs of it will recognize. A bison, rendered on the ceiling of the cave with a naturalism and a precision and a vitality that is astonishing even now, after more than a century of familiarity with it. The animal is painted with its legs tucked under it, in a resting posture, and the lines that describe its form are confident and economical, the work of someone who understood not just the anatomy of the bison, but how to represent it in a way that captured its living quality. The painter worked by firelight on an uneven stone surface, with pigments ground from natural materials, using techniques that we can partially reconstruct, but that involved a level of skill and knowledge we can only partially appreciate. The painter was one of the people of the Cantabrian refugium, one of the Atlantic coastal ancestors of the Basques, and, through the post-glacial expansion, of the Western Scots. Living in the cave system of northern Spain during the last glacial maximum, in conditions that we can barely imagine from our current comfort, they were making art. Art that we can still look at and recognize as art, as the product of a sophisticated visual intelligence and a developed aesthetic sensibility, 17,000 years after it was made. That aesthetic sensibility did not disappear when the ice retreated. It did not die with the specific individuals who made the cave paintings. It was part of the cultural tradition that the Ice Age survivors carried with them as they moved northward along the Atlantic coast when the ice retreated, that expressed itself in new forms in the new landscapes they colonized, that eventually, in the Neolithic period, produced the carved and decorated surfaces of the megalithic monuments, the spiral patterns on the curbstones at Newgrange, the cup and ring marks carved on the rocks of the Scottish uplands, the geometric designs incised on the walls of the passage tomb chambers. These are all part of the same aesthetic tradition that produced the Altamira bison, transformed over thousands of years into new forms appropriate to new cultural contexts, but recognizably part of the same deep impulse to make marks on surfaces in ways that communicate something to whoever sees them. The cup and ring carvings of the Scottish uplands are particularly interesting in this context. They are found across a wide area of Scotland, with particular concentrations in Kilmartin Glen in Argyll, which is on the Atlantic coast of Scotland, in exactly the area of highest retention of the ancient refugium ancestry. They consist of circular depressions and concentric rings carved into exposed bedrock surfaces, often in locations with wide views of the surrounding landscape. Their meaning is not known. Many interpretations have been proposed, from astronomical maps to territorial markers to shamanic symbols to representations of the landscape itself. None has been definitively established. What is known is that they are old, that they belong to the Neolithic and early Bronze Age period, that the people who made them were the descendants of the Atlantic coastal expansion from the Iberian refugium, and that stylistically similar marks are found across the Atlantic facade from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia. The cup and ring tradition is another expression of the shared aesthetic culture of the Atlantic coastal peoples, another piece of evidence that the people who carried the ancient refugium lineage northward maintained a coherent cultural tradition that expressed itself in similar ways across a large geographic range. The Basque Country has its own tradition of engraved stones, its own marks on rock surfaces that belong to the same broad tradition of the Atlantic megalithic culture. And like the Scottish cup and ring marks, the Basque rock engravings are not fully explained. They sit in their landscapes, carrying their marks into the present without providing a clear guide to their meaning, waiting for someone to develop the analytical framework that would allow them to be read. The reading may never be complete. The specific meaning of specific marks in specific contexts may be permanently irretrievable, because the cultural context that gave them meaning is gone, and because marks on stone, unlike written text, do not carry enough internal structure to be decoded without that cultural context. What can be achieved is a better understanding of the formal properties of the marks, their distribution in space and in time, their relationships to other features of the landscape, and their place within the broader tradition of Atlantic coastal symbolic culture. That understanding, while not equivalent to a full decoding, would be much more than we currently have. The same LiDAR technology that has been advocated for in the context of the Canadian Rockies stone sites would be useful in the Atlantic facade context. Many of the rock engraving traditions of the Atlantic coast are known only from the sites that have been found by chance or by targeted survey in areas that were already expected to be productive. A comprehensive survey using LiDAR and related remote sensing technologies, combined with traditional ground survey methods, would almost certainly reveal many more sites than are currently known. And the additional sites would provide the kind of systematic data set that allows the formal properties of the tradition to be analyzed with statistical rigor. That analysis is not happening at the scale it could be. The resources that would allow it are not being directed toward it with the urgency that the significance of the tradition would seem to warrant. The Atlantic megalithic tradition is not a marginal subject. It is one of the most significant aspects of European prehistory. The monuments it produced are World Heritage Sites that attract millions of visitors every year. The culture that produced those monuments is the deep heritage of a substantial fraction of the modern European population. And yet, the systematic investigation of the tradition, at the scale that modern technology would make possible, has not been done. The advocacy for that investigation comes from the same places that advocacy for the Canadian Rockies investigation comes from researchers working at the margins of the mainstream, with inadequate resources, building the case for institutional attention that has not yet fully arrived. From indigenous and regional communities, including the Basques and the Gaelic communities of Scotland and Ireland, who have a stake in how their deep past is understood and who are increasingly developing their own research capacities rather than waiting for outside institutions to take the lead. The convergence of genetic evidence, archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, and community advocacy is building towards something. The same kind of critical mass that has produced the revision of North American prehistoric timelines in recent decades may be building for the Atlantic megalithic tradition, for the deep history of the Atlantic coastal peoples, for the full story of the Ice Age refugium and its consequences for European population history. The story is too rich, the evidence too abundant, the community interest too genuine for the institutional attention to remain at its current level much longer. The Basques and the Western Scots are waiting, as they have always waited, with the patience of people whose tradition has persisted through 12,000 years of change. The question of their shared bloodline, which the science has answered, points to a larger set of questions about the deep Atlantic coastal tradition that the science has not yet fully addressed. Those questions are coming into view, the investigation is building, and the answer, when it is more fully assembled, will add enormously to our understanding of what human civilization in Europe actually was and how it developed. That understanding is worth the effort, the story is worth the telling, and tonight, in the telling, you have received something of what it contains. The Basques and the Scots share a bloodline that goes back to the ice. That is the core of it. The rest, the megaliths and the languages and the maritime traditions and the cave paintings and the cup and ring marks and the stone circles and all the other expressions of the long Atlantic coastal tradition, is what that bloodline, carried by people who were always more than just their DNA, produced across 12,000 years of living in this specific corner of the world. Sleep with the story. The bloodline is old, the tradition is deep, and the people who carry it forward are still here, in the Basque Mountains and the Scottish Islands, speaking their ancient tongues where they can, maintaining their relationships with the landscapes and the seas that have shaped them since the Ice Age. The fire from the refugium is still burning, in the genes, in the languages, in the landscape itself, which remembers in its own way everything that has happened in and on and around it since the first post-glacial settlers arrived at the edge of the retreating ice and looked north, toward the coast, toward the sea, toward the world that was opening up in front of them, as the world that had imprisoned them in ice and cold was finally, slowly, letting go. They walked north. Their descendants kept going. And some of them eventually reached the western islands of Scotland and stopped, because the Atlantic edge was where they had always been going, was where their tradition had always oriented them, was the place that felt, after all the generations of moving, like home. It was home. It has been home ever since. Good night, from the Atlantic edge. From the Ice Age to now, the bloodline is running, as it has always run, through the night and into the morning and forward into whatever comes next. Sleep well. The tradition continues. The Scottish clan system, which most people think of as a medieval institution, is in fact the expression of something very old. The clan is a unit of kinship-based social organization, and kinship-based social organization is one of the oldest forms of human social structure. The specific form of the Scottish Highland clan, with its chief and its warriors and its shared territory and its elaborate traditions of loyalty and hospitality and feud, is a medieval and early modern development. But the underlying logic, of organizing society around extended family groups with shared territories, shared identities, and obligations of mutual support, goes back much further than any medieval institution. The same logic underlies the Basque social organization in its traditional form. The Basque Basserie, the traditional farmhouse and its associated territory, was the basic unit of Basque social and economic organization. Extended family groups organized around the Basserie maintained a collective relationship with a specific piece of land across generations, managing the agricultural and pastoral resources of the territory in ways that required coordination among family members and between adjacent family groups. The specific institutions varied regionally and changed over time, but the underlying structure of kinship-based social organization around a territorial unit is recognizably similar in its logic to the Highland clan. These similarities cannot be directly attributed to a shared prehistoric tradition. Medieval institutions are shaped by too many intervening factors, political, economic, religious, environmental, for a direct line to be drawn from prehistoric social structure to medieval clan organization. But the similarities are worth noting as evidence that the underlying social logic of both traditions may reflect something persistent about how these populations have organized themselves in their specific landscapes. The terrain of the Basque Country and the terrain of the Scottish Highlands are both characterized by poor communication, physical isolation, and the kind of subsistence economy that makes kinship-based cooperation essential. The similar social structures may be independent adaptations to similar environmental pressures, or they may reflect a deeper cultural inheritance from the shared ancestral tradition. Probably some of both. The kinship orientation of both traditions is also reflected in how both cultures have handled the experience of emigration. Both the Basques and the Scots have been significant source populations for emigration, particularly in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. The Scottish Highland clearances, which forcibly removed populations from the Western Highlands and Islands to make way for sheep farming, created a diaspora that settled in Nova Scotia, in Australia, in New Zealand, and across the Americas. The Basque diaspora, driven by the economic and political pressures of the 19th and 20th centuries, established significant communities in Argentina, Uruguay, the Western United States, and elsewhere. Both diasporas maintained unusually strong connections to their places of origin. The Scots who settled in Nova Scotia maintained Scottish Gaelic as a living community language into the 20th century, longer in some places than it survived in Scotland itself. The Basque communities of Nevada and Idaho maintained the Basque language, the Basque pelota game, the Basque festivals, and the Basque sheep-herding tradition in ways that kept them recognizably Basque for generations after emigration. The strength of the diaspora connection to origin is itself a cultural feature, reflecting the deep place attachment that both traditions have always had. The sense that identity is inseparable from a specific territory and a specific community in ways that emigration disrupts but cannot fully sever. The Nova Scotia Scots connection is particularly poignant in the context of the Basque-Scottish genetic story. Nova Scotia means New Scotland in Latin, and the Scottish settlers who arrived there from the Highlands and Islands in the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought with them the Atlantic coastal tradition of the Western Islands, including the Scottish Gaelic language and the maritime orientation and the kinship-based social structures that had characterized the Western Highland and Island communities for centuries. They found a landscape that, while very different from the Hebrides, was also Atlantic-facing, also maritime, also defined by its relationship to the sea, and they built communities in their new landscape that maintained, for as long as they could, the cultural inheritance they had brought across the Atlantic. The Basques, meanwhile, were themselves crossing the Atlantic in the centuries before and after the Scots. The Basque fishermen who were in Newfoundland waters before Columbus, the Basque whalers who established their seasonal stations on the Labrador coast, the Basque emigrants who settled in South America in the 19th century, were all expressions of the same Atlantic orientation. The sea was the Basques' highway, as it had always been, and the Atlantic was the sea they knew best, and the crossing of it, in pursuit of fish or in search of a new life, was a continuity of the maritime tradition that went back to the post-glacial Atlantic expansion. The two traditions, the Basque Atlantic expansion and the Scottish Atlantic diaspora, were happening in different times and for different reasons and in different directions. But they were both expressions of the same fundamental orientation, the Atlantic as a medium of movement rather than a barrier that the ancient lineage had always carried. The children of the Ice Age refugium, expanding northward along the Atlantic coast in the post-glacial period, and the Basque fishermen crossing the North Atlantic in the 15th century, and the Highland Scots crossing it in the 19th, were all doing the same thing at different scales and in different historical contexts. They were following the sea. They were doing what the Atlantic coastal tradition had always done. The Atlantic is the great connecting medium of this story. It connects the Iberian refugium to the British Isles in the post-glacial expansion. It connects the megalith builders in their exchange networks across the Atlantic facade. It connects the Basque fishermen to the waters of the Western Atlantic. It connects the Scottish diaspora to Nova Scotia and Australia and New Zealand. And it connects, in the deepest and most ancient sense, the Basques and the Western Scots to each other, because the sea was their shared highway long before any nation-state drew the borders that now seem to separate them. The borders are recent. The connection is old. And the connection, expressed in the genetic marker that runs from the Ice Age refugium through both populations, is older than any border that human beings have ever drawn on any map. That is the perspective the deep story provides. The borders and the nations and the languages and the political identities are all things of the last few thousand years. The bloodline is 12,000 years old. The Atlantic is older still. And the relationship between the Atlantic and the people who have been living on its eastern shore since the ice retreated is the oldest and deepest fact about both the Basques and the Western Scots that genetics can currently access. Knowing that fact changes the perspective, if you let it. The Basque Country is not just a minority nation within Spain and France. It is the heart of the oldest continuous cultural tradition in Western Europe, a tradition that has been in this place since before farming arrived, since before the Indo-European languages existed, since before any of the nation-states that now govern this part of the world had been imagined. The Western Scottish Islands are not just the remote periphery of a small country. They are the far end of one of the most ancient demographic expansions in human history, the Atlantic coastal migration from the Iberian refugium, and they have been inhabited by the descendants of that migration, since the ice retreated and the sea stopped being a solid floor and became the medium of movement it has been ever since. Both places are deeper than their surface histories suggest. Both carry in their landscapes and their peoples and their surviving traditions the weight of a past that reaches back to the ice. And the bloodline that connects them is the biological record of that depth, the most durable trace of the most ancient layer of the human story of the Atlantic coast. The depth is worth knowing. The connection is worth understanding. And the story, which the genetics has made visible and which the archaeology and the linguistics and the cultural traditions fill in from different angles, is worth telling and hearing and carrying into the future. You have heard it tonight. You will carry some part of it forward, into your sleeping and your waking, and whatever you think about in the days that come after tonight. The bloodline of the Basques and the Scots, the Ice Age connection, the Atlantic coastal tradition, the survival in the refugium, the northward expansion, the megalithic monuments, the maritime networks, the ancient language, the genetic marker that runs unbroken from the last glacial maximum to the present. You know it now. The knowledge is yours. What you do with it is also yours. Sleep with it tonight. The Atlantic is out there, dark and moving, connecting the places whose stories you now know. The Basque Mountains are there, with their cromlechs and their oak forests and their ancient language. The Scottish Islands are there, with their stone circles and their Atlantic light and their Gaelic and their memories of the sea. The bloodline runs between them. The night runs between them. And somewhere in both places, someone is probably awake right now. For whatever reason, people are awake in the small hours, and they are under the same sky you are under, connected by the ancient lineage to each other and by the story you have just heard to you. Good night. The bloodline is old, the tradition is deep, and the night, which is shorter than the story and longer than the telling, is doing what nights have always done, carrying everything forward into the morning. Sleep well. The DNA of a living person is a library. Not a library organized in any way that makes it easy to read, without specialized equipment and training. A library with no catalogue, no subject headings, no index, Just the raw information of billions of base pairs arranged in a sequence that encodes everything from the color of your eyes to the structure of your immune system to, buried deep in the specifically male line inheritance of the Y chromosome, the record of your patrilineal ancestry stretching back through every father and grandfather and great-grandfather in your direct male line to wherever that line began. Reading that library took most of the 20th century to become possible, and most of the early 21st century, to become cheap and fast enough to apply to thousands of people at once, and to ancient remains that had been in the ground for thousands of years. The technology that made the ancient DNA revolution possible is one of the most remarkable scientific achievements of recent decades, and the story of European population history that it has told is one of the most transformative contributions to our understanding of the human past that any scientific development has ever made. Before the ancient DNA data, European population history was reconstructed from the patterns of variation in living populations, which could tell you something about relationships between current populations, but could not tell you directly about the historical events that produced those patterns. The ancient DNA data, by reading the genomes of individuals who lived at specific times in specific places, allows a much more direct reconstruction of what actually happened. Not a reconstruction from the end result backward, but a reading of the process itself at the specific moments when the process was occurring. What the ancient DNA data has revealed about the deep population history of the Atlantic coast is the story we have been following: the post-glacial colonization by Western hunter-gatherers from the Iberian refugium, the arrival of the Anatolian farmers in the Neolithic period, the arrival of the steppe ancestry in the Bronze Age, the differential impact of these demographic events across the geographic range of the Atlantic facade, with the most peripheral populations, the Basques and the Western Scots, retaining higher proportions of the earliest layer, the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, than the populations of the continental interior. The data is still coming in. Every new ancient genome from an Atlantic coast site adds to the picture, and the picture, as it fills in, is consistently more complex and more interesting than any model that preceded the data. There were more populations, there was more movement. The transitions between demographic episodes were less clean and more gradual than the simple three-component model suggests. The specific regional histories of different parts of the Atlantic facade show local patterns that the continental average does not capture. For the Basque Country specifically, the ancient DNA data has confirmed the persistence of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry through the Neolithic period at higher levels than in surrounding populations, has shown the arrival of steppe ancestry in the Bronze Age, but at lower levels than in most of Europe, and has tracked the gradual convergence of the Basque genetic profile towards something resembling what we see in the modern Basque population. The modern Basques are not identical to their Mesolithic ancestors. They have absorbed the Neolithic farmer ancestry and a degree of the Bronze Age steppe ancestry, but they have retained more of the ancient lineage than anyone around them. For the Western Scottish population, the ancient DNA data is less complete, partly because the cool, wet conditions of the Hebrides are not ideal for DNA preservation, and partly because the systematic sampling of ancient Scottish sites for genomic analysis is still in its earlier stages. But the samples that have been analysed show patterns consistent with what the living population genetics predicts. Higher levels of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the most Atlantic peripheral populations. A Bronze Age transformation that was less complete than in the continental interior, and in the Mesolithic samples from Scottish coastal sites, genomes that closely resemble the Western hunter-gatherer profile and are most similar to the modern Basques among modern European populations. The picture will get clearer as more samples are analysed. The specific regional history of the Western Scottish Islands, from the first post-glacial colonisation through the Neolithic megalithic period, through the Bronze Age transformation through the Gaelic expansion and the Norse influence and the historical period, will be reconstructible in much more detail than is currently possible. And that reconstruction will document, in the biological record, the persistence of the ancient lineage that the living population genetics points to but cannot document as directly. The documentation matters. It matters for the scientific story, because direct evidence of population history is more reliable than inferences from living populations. But it also matters for the human story, for the communities whose deep past is being reconstructed. The Basques and the Gaelic communities of Scotland have a stake in how their ancestral history is understood, and that stake is not just scientific, it is cultural, political, and deeply personal. The history that the genetics is telling is a history of survival, of a lineage that made it through the last ice age, and then through the demographic transformations of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, and through all the subsequent upheavals of the historical period. In both cases, the survival was not passive. It was active, in the sense that the specific geographic and cultural circumstances that allowed the lineage to persist were themselves the product of the choices and the strategies of the people who carried it. The Basques did not simply hide in their mountains while the rest of Europe was transformed. They maintained a cultural tradition that was strong enough and adaptive enough to accommodate the changes, including the partial acceptance of farming and the partial incorporation of steppe ancestry, while retaining enough of the old way to preserve the essential character of the ancient lineage. The Western Scots did the same, in their own way, on their own terrain. They were not untouched by the Bronze Age transformation. They adopted the new genetic profile to a degree. They eventually adopted the Gaelic language of the incoming population, but they retained, in the specific geographic periphery of the Western Islands, enough of the old ancestry and enough of the old orientation to the sea and the landscape that the essential character of the ancient Atlantic coastal tradition was not entirely replaced. It was transformed, overlaid with new elements, expressed in new cultural forms, but not replaced. The thread ran through. From the Ice Age to the present, through every transformation the thread ran through. And tonight, you know that the thread exists, and what it is, and where it came from, and what it means. The thread is still running. In the Basque Country and in the Western Scottish Islands, and in all the places in the world where their descendants have carried the ancient lineage, it will keep running. The Ice Age was 12,000 years ago. The thread has been running since then without interruption. There is no reason to think it will stop. Sleep now. The thread is running through you, in the sense that you carry the story now. The biological thread runs through the Basques and the Scots. The narrative thread, the story of what the biological thread means and where it came from, runs through everyone who has heard it and understood it and will remember it. You have heard it. You understand it. You will remember some of it. The thread is running. Good night. There is a word in Scottish Gaelic, sianalas, that does not translate cleanly into any other language. It is sometimes rendered as hiraeth in Welsh, which is also not translatable. Both words describe something like longing for home, but not the simple longing of someone who has been away and wants to return. Something more complex. A longing for a home that may not exist anymore, or that may never have existed in quite the form you long for, but that feels more real than any present place you occupy. A longing that is not about a specific place so much as about a specific quality of being at home that you carry as a felt absence. A negative space in your experience shaped exactly like the place that would fill it. The Basques have something similar, though the specific word is different. The deep attachment to the Basque homeland, to Euskal Herria, has always had this quality for Basques in diaspora, the quality of longing for a home that is more than a geographic location, that is also a language and a culture and a way of being in the world that the geography of the homeland made possible, and that is only imperfectly reproducible anywhere else. Both of these feelings, sianalas and its Basque equivalent, are what you would expect from people whose relationship with their specific landscape goes back as far as the relationship of the Basques and the Western Scots with their landscapes goes back. When a people has been in a place for 12,000 years, the relationship between people and place goes deeper than what the language of modern real estate or modern tourism or even modern national identity can capture. It is in the body. It is in the way certain light looks familiar even when you are in it for the first time. It is in the particular physical comfort of a landscape that your biology, shaped by thousands of years of adaptation to that specific place, recognizes as home even before your conscious mind has processed where you are. That depth of belonging is part of what is at stake in the stories of both the Basques and the Western Scots. Not just the political questions of autonomy and language rights and cultural preservation, though those are real and important, but something older and less articulable than politics. The question of what it means to be a people in a place for a very long time, of what the relationship between a people and a landscape becomes when it has had enough time to go all the way down, of what is lost when that relationship is severed, whether by forced displacement, as in the highland clearances, or by cultural assimilation, as in the slow erosion of the minority language tradition under the pressure of the dominant surrounding language. What is lost is the Cyanalas in advance, the longing for what is being lost before it is fully gone, the felt sense of a home slipping away not because you are moving from it, but because it is being changed around you, because the landscape is the same, but the relationship to it that made it home is fraying. That is what the endangered language expresses, in both the Basque and the Gaelic cases, not just a communication system at risk, a way of being at home in a specific place that the language is the vehicle for, and that may not survive the loss of the language in any form that the people who come after can access. This is not hopeless. Both traditions are showing resilience. The Basque language has genuine revitalization momentum. Scottish Gaelic is being learned by people who did not grow up speaking it, including people who are not ethnically Scottish, but who are drawn to the language by the particular quality of the relationship with the world it encodes. Both traditions are being documented, preserved, studied, transmitted in new ways that the technological possibilities of the current moment make available. The thread is being maintained, but the fragility is real, and the depth of what is fragile is part of why the fragility matters as much as it does. These are not just languages, these are 12,000-year-old relationships between people and places, expressed through the medium of language in ways that the languages have been shaped by, and that can only be fully experienced through those languages. When a language dies, something specific and irreplaceable dies with it. The Cyanalas for the dying language begins before the death. The genetics is not the most important thing about the Basque-Scottish connection. The genetics is evidence. It is proof of a demographic fact that the historical record could not provide. It establishes the deep antiquity of the connection and gives it a biological reality that is not subject to the ambiguities of comparative mythology or architectural similarity or other forms of evidence that can be explained in multiple ways. But the most important thing about the connection is not the Y chromosome haplogroup. It is the 12,000-year story that the haplogroup traces. The survival in the refugium, the expansion along the Atlantic coast, the megalithic tradition, the maritime networks, the language, the Cyanalas. The story is what the genetics points to, and the story, once you know it, makes the Cyanalas comprehensible in a new way. The longing for home that is more than home, the feeling of belonging to a place at a depth that cannot be fully articulated. These are not mysterious psychological phenomena without explanation. They are what 12,000 years of continuous presence in a specific landscape produces in a people. They are the felt dimension of a biological and cultural fact. The place and the people have had time to know each other completely, in the way that only very long acquaintance allows. And the longing, when the relationship is threatened, is proportional to the depth of what is at risk. The depth is everything. That is the final lesson of the Basque-Scottish bloodline story. The depth is everything. Not in the sense that history is more important than the present, or that the deep past trumps the immediate concerns of people living their lives in difficult circumstances, but in the sense that understanding the depth of where you come from changes how you understand where you are. The Basques and the Western Scots are not just contemporary minority communities with interesting cultural traditions and a difficult relationship with the dominant cultures around them. They are the living endpoints of one of the longest continuous traditions in European history. They are the people who most directly carry, in their biology and in what survives of their cultural heritage, the inheritance of the Atlantic coastal ancestors who survived the ice and then built the world that the rest of Europe eventually occupied and transformed. That inheritance is not a burden, it is a depth, a richness, a source of the particular quality of presence that the places with very long human histories have, the quality that draws people to them even when they cannot fully articulate why. The Basque Country and the Western Scottish Islands draw people because they are beautiful, and because they have interesting cultures, and because the food is extraordinary in the Basque case, and the landscape is extraordinary in both cases. But they also draw people because of the depth, because of the sense that something very old is present here, because of the weight of the long relationship between the people and the place that has had 12,000 years to develop and that is still, in some attenuated and pressured but real form, alive. That aliveness is worth protecting, worth understanding, worth telling stories about on nights when the day is behind you and the quiet is settling and the time for the deep story has arrived. The time is now. The story has been told. And the deep Atlantic coastal tradition, which produced the cave paintings of Altamira and the megaliths of Newgrange and the stones of Callanise and the language of the Basques and the Cyanalas of the Western Scots, is present tonight in the telling of it. Present in the minds that have received it. Present in whatever you will carry forward from this telling into the rest of your life. That is a small piece of the tradition continuing. Stories are how traditions continue. The genetics continues in the bodies of people who carry it. The tradition continues in the minds of people who know the story. Both kinds of continuity matter. Both kinds of transmission are real. The story is in you now. Sleep with it. Dream about the Ice Age refugium and the Atlantic coast and the people who survived and expanded and built monuments to the sky and sailed the same sea that their ancestors had been sailing since before any written history existed. Dream about the bloodline that connects the Basques and the Scots across 12,000 years of everything that the planet and human history could produce. Dream about the depth, the beautiful, irreplaceable, fragile, ancient, living depth of the tradition that the genetics has made visible and that the story has carried to you tonight. Good night. The Ice Age survivors would not have imagined you, but they survived so that a future could exist. You are part of that future. You have heard their story. That is more than enough. Rest now. The final thing worth sitting with, before the night takes everything into itself, is something that the genetics cannot tell you, but that the story implies at every turn. It is the question of what the Ice Age survivors understood about themselves and their situation. They did not know they were living in a refugium. The word is ours, imposed on their experience from the outside by researchers who came 12,000 years later and named what they had been part of. They did not know they were the ancestors of the Basques and the Western Scots. They did not know that the lineage they were carrying would persist through 12,000 years of demographic change and still be visible in living people at the far ends of the continent they had not yet begun to colonize. They did not know any of the things that we now know about them and about the significance of their survival. What they knew was their world, the particular valley in the Cantabrian hills where they had their settlement, the river that ran through it, and the specific pools where the salmon gathered in autumn, the ridge above the valley and what the sky looked like from it on a clear winter night. The painting of the bison on the cave ceiling, made by someone whose name they knew and whose technique they admired, and whose relationship to the great herds they understood in ways we cannot fully recover. The smell of the pine resin burning in the fat-fueled lamps that lit their work in the deep parts of the cave. The weight of the flint scraper in the hand. The sound of the language that only they could speak. They knew their world completely, in the way that people who have been in one place for a very long time know it completely. And they passed that complete knowledge on to their children, who passed it to theirs, generation after generation through the worst the planet could throw at them, not as an act of heroism, not as a conscious effort to preserve a tradition for the benefit of descendants they could not imagine, but as the simple, continuous, unremarkable transmission of what you know to the people who come after you, because that is what living things do. They transmit, they continue, they persist. The persistence is the heroism, in retrospect, not experienced as heroism at the time, experienced as the daily work of survival, the finding of food and shelter and warmth and company that is the baseline of any human life. But the daily work, sustained over generation after generation through the 25,000 years of the last glacial maximum, and then through the warming and the northward expansion and the Neolithic transformation and the Bronze Age and all the rest of it, is what the word survival actually means at the species and population level. Not a single heroic act. The long, daily, unremarkable act of continuing, of being there tomorrow when you are here today, of having children who will be there after you. The Ice Age survivors were there tomorrow, and the next day, and for 12,000 days of tomorrows after the ice retreated, their descendants kept being there, in the Basque Mountains and on the Scottish Islands and everywhere else along the Atlantic coast where the post-glacial expansion took them. And the thread of the Y chromosome, passed from father to son in the specific male line inheritance that the genetics can trace, ran through all of it, unchanged in its essential character, carrying the record of every generation from the Ice Age to now. That record is in living people today. not just as a historical curiosity, not just as a scientific finding that population geneticists write papers about, but as a biological reality in the bodies of real people who are alive right now, going about their daily lives in the Basque Country, and in the western Scottish Islands, and in the diaspora communities around the world where their descendants have settled. Real people who have no particular awareness that they carry an Ice Age lineage, who are not defined by it in any way that their daily experience makes salient, but who carry it nonetheless. In the Y chromosome of Basque men who work in San Sebastian and speak Euskara to their children and eat pinzos in the Old Quarter and have no particular reason to think about the last glacial maximum. In the Y chromosome of Scottish men in the Outer Hebrides who go out in their boats in the morning and come back in the evening and speak Gaelic to their neighbours and have no particular reason to think about the post-glacial Atlantic. Expansion. The thread is in them. It has always been in them. It will be in their sons and their sons' sons, for as long as the lineage continues, for as long as the tradition of being in that specific place with that specific relationship to the landscape and the sea continues to produce people who have sons who have sons. The tradition is old, the thread is strong, and the night, which is shorter than the story and longer than most things, is the right time to let the story settle into whatever place in you it will occupy. Let it settle. Let the Ice Age and the Atlantic and the refugium and the expansion and the megaliths and the languages and the cyanallas and the bison on the cave ceiling and the cup and ring marks on the Scottish rocks and the cromlechs in the Basque mountains and the shared Y chromosome running through, all of it, let all of that find its place in you. It is a good story. It is a true story. And it is, in the deepest sense, your story too, because you are a human being, and the human beings who survived the Ice Age and expanded along the Atlantic coast and built the megalithic monuments and sailed the Bay of Biscay and carved the standing stones and kept the language alive are your species. Their survival is what made your existence possible, however indirect and however many steps removed the connection might be. You are the future they survived toward, all of us are. Sleep well. The bloodline runs, the tradition persists. The Ice Age is over, and the world it produced, the world of the Atlantic coast, and the ancient lineage, and the deep belonging of the Basques and the Scots to their specific places, is still here, after everything. Good night. There is one more layer of the story that deserves to be named before the night fully closes around it. It is the layer that the genetics and the archaeology and the language all point toward, but that none of them can fully reach. The layer of what it felt like, to the people who lived this story from inside it, to be the people they were in the places they were. What did it feel like to be one of the Atlantic coastal people in the Neolithic, building the megalithic monuments, to be part of the community that organized the labor and quarried the stone and transported it over distance and set it in the ground with such precision? The archaeological evidence tells you the external facts. The genetic evidence tells you who those people were in biological terms. But the inner life, the experience of participating in the tradition, the meaning that the work had for the individuals doing it, is inaccessible to any scientific method. It is accessible, in a partial and indirect way, through imagination, through the willingness to sit with the evidence and ask what it implies about the inner life of the people who left it. The scale of the megalithic monuments implies community. Not just the physical community of people working together on a construction project, but the cultural community of people who share a belief about why the work matters, who are united by a common understanding of what the stones are for and why they are worth the effort. You do not build Newgrange by accident. You build it because your community has a reason to build it, a reason compelling enough to organize the labor and sustain the effort over years or decades. The astronomical orientations of the monuments tell you something about the reason. The winter solstice, the summer solstice, the equinoxes, the major lunar standstills that the Kalanaya's alignment incorporates. These are moments in the turning of the year that matter to a community whose survival depends on reading the year correctly. The farmers who had arrived in the Neolithic period depended on knowing when to plant and when to harvest. The pastoralists who moved their animals between summer and winter pastures depended on knowing when to make the seasonal movements. The fishermen who worked the Atlantic depended on knowing the seasons of the fish and the tides and the weather patterns that the year's turning determined. Marking the turning accurately in a form that was permanent and visible and accessible to the whole community, was not just a religious or ceremonial act. It was also a practical act. The great stone monuments were, among other things, community calendars, permanent records of the relationship between the sky and the year that anyone in the community could reference. That the marking was done with such elaboration, with such investment of labor and such precision of alignment, tells you that the community found it worth doing at the highest level of cultural achievement available to it. The monuments were not the minimum required to serve the calendar function. They were the maximum that the community could achieve. They were the community's best work, directed toward the most important task. That combination, the practical and the ceremonial, the useful and the beautiful, the calendar function and the artistic achievement, is one of the most recognizably human things about the megalithic tradition. Human beings do not typically do the minimum necessary for survival. We elaborate, we aestheticize, we find reasons to make things beautiful that are not strictly necessary for the function they serve. The megalithic monuments are an ancient and powerful expression of that specifically human tendency. They are as good as the people who built them could make them, because those people, like all human beings, wanted to do their best work on the things that mattered most to them. The things that mattered most were the sky and the dead and the turning of the year. That is what the monuments tell you. And the people who made them, the descendants of the Atlantic coastal expansion from the Iberian refugium, the bearers of the ancient lineage that still shows up in the Basques and the Western Scots, were people for whom the sky and the dead and the turning of the year were worth the best work they could do. They did their best work. It is still there. At Newgrange, and at Callanize, and at Carnac, and in the Basque Mountains, and in all the other places along the Atlantic facade, where the stones still stand in their patterns, having outlasted by thousands of years the people who placed them. The best work of the Ice Age survivors' descendants, done in the service of the things that mattered most to them, is the most durable part of their legacy. The genetic lineage is more durable, technically. DNA in a living body is being copied and maintained and transmitted in ways that stone cannot be. But the stone is more visible, more accessible, more capable of producing in the human beings who encounter it the specific response of awe in the presence of something very old and very deliberate. That response is itself part of the legacy. The monuments produce it in us. That production, that transmission of something from the ancient builders to the modern observers across 5,000 years of time is a kind of communication, not in words, not in any specific content that can be decoded, but in the register of scale and precision and age and the felt sense that this was made by human beings who were trying to say something that would last. They succeeded. The saying is still lasting. In the stones at Newgrange that let the winter solstice light into the chamber every year, as it has been doing for more than 5,000 years. In the stones at Callanize that align to the lunar standstill against the hills of Lewis. In the cromlechs of the Basque Mountains that have been in their positions in the high pastures since before anyone now living was born. In the genetic marker that runs through the Basque and Scottish populations and connects them to the people who built those stones. It is all one story. One long, continuous 12,000-year story of a people and a tradition and a lineage and a landscape and a sea. The Basque-Scottish bloodline is the genetic thread of that story. The megaliths are the material thread. The language is the linguistic thread. The maritime tradition is the cultural thread. And tonight, the telling is the narrative thread, running through you as the others run through the Basques and the Scots, carrying the story forward into whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep now. Every thread has done its work for tonight. The story is told. The connection is named. The depth is acknowledged. The Ice Age survivors would be satisfied if satisfaction were something you could carry across 12,000 years and feel at the successful transmission of a story. They kept the lineage going so that there would be a future. The future is here. The story is in it. Good night, from the Atlantic coast, from the refugium, from the depth of the oldest tradition in Western Europe. Good night, from the Basque Mountains and the Scottish Islands and the 12,000 years that run between them like a river that has never stopped flowing. Good night. The sea between the Basque Country and Scotland is not empty. It is full of the same Atlantic currents that have been moving in it since before there were human beings to sail them. The Gulf Stream comes up from the south and the west, carrying warm water that moderates the climate of the entire Atlantic facade, making the western coast of Europe habitable in ways that the same latitudes in other parts of the world are not. The Labrador Current comes down from the north, cold and rich with nutrients that make the meeting of the two currents one of the most productive fishing grounds in the world. The tides move in their complex patterns around the islands and peninsulas, predictable to anyone who has learned to read them, unpredictable to anyone who has not. The people of the Atlantic coast have been reading those currents and those tides and those patterns for longer than any other people in the world have been reading them. Since the post-glacial expansion brought the descendants of the Ice Age survivors to the Atlantic facade, since the first Mesolithic settlers reached the Scottish islands and found the sea that was to be the medium of their existence for all the generations that followed. Since the Basque fishermen first learned the patterns of the Bay of Biscay and then pushed further, following the fish and the whale and the cod into waters that no other European people of their era had reached. The reading of the sea is in the bloodline, in the sense that any deeply transmitted cultural competence is in the bloodline, not in the DNA, because specific skills are not genetically inherited, but in the tradition that the DNA traces, the culture that the ancient lineage has carried, the orientation to the sea that has shaped both the Basque and the Western Scottish traditions in ways that go deeper than any specific skill or technology. The relationship with the Atlantic as home, as resource, as highway, as the medium of identity. That relationship is 12,000 years old. The sea has not changed in any way that matters for the human relationship with it in 12,000 years, the same currents, the same tides, the same patterns of weather and fish, and the specific seasonal rhythms that the Atlantic coast produces. The people have changed, the languages have changed, the boats have changed, the technology has changed beyond recognition. But the sea itself is the same sea that the post-glacial settlers first encountered when they reached the coast from the inland refugium and found in the richness of the Atlantic marine environment the resource base that would sustain the tradition they were building. The tradition is still there, transformed and reduced and pressured by the modern world in ways that would be unrecognizable to the Mesolithic settlers of the Hebrides or the Neolithic builders of the Atlantic megalithic monuments, but still there, still alive in the communities that have maintained the longest continuous relationship with this sea of any people in the world, still expressed in the language of the Basques, who have words for the specific conditions of the Bay of Biscay that no other language in the world has developed, still expressed in the remaining communities of Scottish Gaelic speakers who know the Atlantic coast of the Hebrides with an intimacy that 12,000 years of relationship produces. The intimacy is what the bloodline ultimately encodes. Not a genetic predisposition to maritime activity, which is not how genetics works, but the demographic record of a tradition of intimacy with this specific sea, carried by the people who developed that intimacy over the longest time, who passed it on through the generations, who maintained it through all the disruptions and transformations of the past 12,000 years, who are still here, still on the Atlantic coast, still in relationship with the same sea their ancestors were in relationship with, when the ice retreated and the world opened up and the great adventure of the post-glacial Atlantic expansion began. That is the bloodline. That is the connection. That is what the genetics reveals, and what the story tells, and what the Cyanalas feels, and what the stones of the megalithic monuments express, and what the languages encode, and what the sea between the Basque Country and Scotland carries, in its currents, invisibly, without knowing it, from one end of the Atlantic facade to the other. The sea is out there tonight, dark and moving and indifferent to our stories about it. The Basque Country is there, with its mountains and its language and its ancient tradition. Scotland is there, with its islands and its Atlantic coast, and its Gaelic and its 12,000-year relationship with the sea. And between them, the bloodline runs, in the Y chromosomes of men who carry it without knowing what it is, who carry it because their fathers carried it and their fathers' fathers carried it, all the way back to the first post-glacial settlers who followed the Atlantic coast northward from the refugium and found in the sea the home that their descendants have been living in ever since. Good night. The sea is running, the bloodline is running, the tradition is running, and the night, which is shorter than the story and longer than the telling, is carrying everything forward into the morning. Sleep well. You have been in the presence of something very old tonight, something that was already old when the pyramids were built, something that will still be there, in some form, long after the world we know has been transformed into something we cannot imagine. The bloodline persists. The sea remains. Good night. The last image. A man in the Basque Mountains and a man on a Scottish island, neither knowing the other exists, neither aware that they share a Y chromosome haplogroup that runs back to the last ice age. The Basque man is watching the sun set over the Bay of Biscay from a hillside above his village. The Scottish man is watching the sun set over the Minch from the shore of the island his family has been on for generations beyond counting. Same sun, same direction, different sea, but the same ocean. Different hill and shore, but the same orientation. Facing west, facing the Atlantic, facing the direction that their tradition has always faced, since the first post-glacial settlers turned northward from the refugium and followed the coast toward the farthest places the sea would carry them. They do not know each other, but the bloodline runs between them, through the 12,000 years of Atlantic coast and the Ice Age, survival and all the rest of it, connecting them in the most fundamental biological sense. In the record of every father and son between the Ice Age and now, the connection is real, it is measurable, it is 12,000 years old, and it is still running, in them, right now, as the same sun goes down behind the same horizon. Good night. The sun will rise again tomorrow, the bloodline will still be running, and the story, which started in the ice and has been running ever since, will continue into whatever morning brings. Rest now. The night is deep now. The telling is done. The story, which started with a genetic marker on a Y chromosome and ended 12,000 years earlier in the Ice Age refugium of southwestern Europe, has run its full length. You have followed it from the science to the landscape to the language to the stones to the sea to the feeling of cyanalas that the whole tradition produces in the people who carry it and love it and are trying, against the pressure of the modern world, to keep it alive. The keeping alive is itself an act of continuation. Every person who speaks Euskara today is keeping something alive that predates Rome, predates the Indo-European languages, predates farming in Europe. Every person who speaks Scottish, Gaelic in the Western Islands, is keeping alive a tradition that, though the language itself is younger, is rooted in a relationship with the Atlantic coast that goes back to the post-glacial settlers. Every researcher who documents the ancient DNA and tells the story of the Atlantic coastal expansion is keeping alive the knowledge of where these people come from and how deep their roots go. The roots are deep. You know that now. Sleep with that knowledge. Let it settle into the quiet of the night and find its place alongside everything else you know about the world. The world is older than it looks. The people in it are older than their histories suggest. And the connections between them, the bloodlines and the traditions and the stories and the long relationships between peoples and places, run deeper than any border or any name or any national identity that the last few thousand years have managed to produce. The Basques and the Scots know this, in the way that very old peoples know it, in the bones, in the language, in the cyanalas for a home that is also a history. Good night. The history is yours now too. Sleep well. The Ice Age survivors made sure there would be a tomorrow. There was, there is, there will be. Good night. The stars are out tonight, over the Bay of Biscay, and over the Minch, and over wherever you are right now. The same stars that were above the refugium during the last glacial maximum. The same stars the megalith builders aligned their stones to. The same stars the Basque fishermen navigated by in the North Atlantic. The same stars above the western Scottish islands for every generation of the people who have been there since the ice retreated. The stars do not change on human timescales. They are the one constant in the story. The people change, the languages change, the cultures change, the borders change. But the stars keep their positions and their patterns and their silent presence above the Atlantic coast, as they have always done, as they will keep doing. Look up, if you can. Or close your eyes and remember what the night sky looks like. That is the sky the Ice Age survivors looked up at. The same sky. Good night. The bloodline runs. The night holds. Sleep well. The ancient sky remains. The story is complete.